Alright, stop scrolling for just 1 second because I need to ask you something. Do you actually think you know Family Guy Season 1? Because I thought I did. I grew up watching it, rewatched it probably a dozen times over the years, and I genuinely believed I had a solid handle on where it came from, how it was made, and what those early episodes were really about. Then I went deep. I mean really deep into the history of this show. And what I found completely changed the way I look at those first episodes. There are facts buried in the origin of Family Guy Season 1 that most fans, even the obsessive ones, have absolutely no idea about. And once you hear them, you will never watch those early episodes the same way again. So if you have ever spent even 5 minutes with Peter Griffin and the gang, you need to stick with me through this entire video. Because I promise you, by the end, and your understanding of one of television's most culturally significant animated shows is going to be fundamentally different. Let's get into it. Let's start at the very beginning, because the story of how Family Guy actually came to exist is genuinely one of the most unlikely origin stories in television history. The show was created by Seth MacFarlane, and by the time it premiered, he was just 24 years old. 24. Think about that for a moment. When most people are still figuring out their careers, still deciding what city they even want to live in, Seth MacFarlane was launching what would eventually become one of the most recognizable animated franchises in the history of American television. But the path that got him there is where things start getting really interesting. MacFarlane had been developing his style at Rhode Island School of Design, and during his time there, he created short animated films that would lay the actual groundwork for Family Guy. One of these was called The Life of Larry, and another was called Larry and Steve. These shorts featured a bumbling, not particularly bright middle-aged man and his more intellectually capable dog companion. Sound familiar? Because that dynamic, that exact relationship between a lovable but dim man and a smart dog, became the foundational blueprint for Peter and Brian Griffin. The Griffins essentially evolved directly from these student film characters, which means the roots of Family Guy go all the way back to college art projects. That alone is remarkable. MacFarlane sent these shorts to Hanna-Barbera, actually got hired there after graduation, and the rest of that story started building toward what we now know as Season 1. But here is something that tends to get glossed over when people talk about the show's history. Family Guy did not premiere to massive fanfare. When it first aired on January 31st, 1999, following the Super Bowl 33 broadcast, the show had an enormous built-in audience. Fox had strategically placed the pilot episode right after one of the most watched television events of the year. Tens of millions of people saw that first episode simply because they were already sitting there with their televisions on, and the ratings were genuinely impressive in that initial window. But what followed in the regular time slot was a much more complicated picture. The show was not an immediate runaway hit in the traditional sense. It was a slow burn, a complicated and contested early life that would eventually lead to one of the most dramatic stories in television history. We will get to that part later. But understanding that the Super Bowl launch was both a massive blessing and a complicated setup is important context for everything that follows. Now let's talk about the actual content of Season 1, because there are specific episode details and behind-the-scenes facts that most people have never heard. The first season was only 7 episodes long. 7. In an era when most network television seasons ran upward of 20 episodes, Fox gave Family Guy just 7 episodes to make its case. This is actually crucial to understanding the creative decisions made in those early episodes. The writers and MacFarlane knew they were working with an extremely tight window to establish these characters, establish the world, and establish the show's comedic voice. Every single episode in that first season carried enormous weight because there was no room for filler. There was no throwaway episode in a 7-episode season. Each installment had to pull its weight. And when you rewatch Season 1 with that knowledge, you start noticing how intentional the character introductions feel. The pilot episode, Death Has a Shadow, does something genuinely smart from a storytelling perspective. It establishes Peter as someone who makes catastrophically bad decisions but means well. It shows Lois as the more capable and grounded partner. It introduces the kids with their defining characteristics already in place, and it uses Brian as the voice of reason. All of that happens in a single episode. The show did not take 3 or 4 episodes to find its footing in terms of character definition. It walked in already knowing who these people were. That level of clarity in a pilot episode is rarer than you might think. One of the things that surprises people when they go back to season 1 is how different the animation looks compared to what the show became. The early episodes have a noticeably rougher quality, slightly different character proportions, and a visual style that feels a bit more tentative than the polished look the show developed in later seasons. This is actually completely normal for animated shows, which go through enormous visual evolution over their runs. But the degree of change between Season 1 Family Guy and the show in its later years is striking when you put them side by side. Characters look subtly but distinctly different. The color palette is slightly different. Even the way scenes are staged feels a little less confident than what came later. This is worth paying attention to because it reminds you that you were watching a creative team that was still figuring out its own visual language in real time. Let's talk about Stewie Griffin for a moment, because the character in Season 1 is genuinely fascinating and quite different from what he eventually became. In those first 7 episodes, Stewie is played almost entirely straight as a legitimate villain. His plots for world domination are presented as real threats within the logic of the show. His contempt for Lois is visceral and played with actual menace. The joke is partly that this infant is homicidal and megalomaniacal, but the creative team was fully committed to letting Stewie be genuinely sinister. There is a darkness to early Stewie that the show gradually softened over time as the character became more of a comedic foil and eventually evolved into the version that most modern viewers know, which leans much harder into his flamboyance and his relationship with Brian. But in Season 1, Stewie was conceived and executed as a character with genuine menace, and that original intention gives those early episodes a distinct energy. Here is something that will actually blow your mind if you have never thought about it before. When Family Guy premiered, The Simpsons had already been on the air for 10 years. 10 years of establishing what an animated primetime family comedy could be, what it should look like, and what audiences expected from it. MacFarlane and his team were launching into a landscape where The Simpsons had essentially defined the entire genre. The critical comparisons were immediate and relentless. But critics in 1999 overwhelmingly described Family Guy as a Simpsons knockoff, as derivative, as a lesser imitation of something that had already been done better. These reviews were brutal in some cases, genuinely dismissive, and they reflected a media environment that was not particularly interested in giving the show the benefit of the doubt. Understanding this critical reception context is important because it shaped everything that followed. The show launched under a cloud of critical skepticism that it would spend years fighting against, and yet the audience response was genuinely different from the critical response. While critics were largely underwhelmed, viewers who actually watched those early episodes found something in Family Guy that kept them coming back. The humor style was different from The Simpsons in ways that mattered to a specific generation. The cutaway gag structure, where the show would interrupt itself to show a completely unrelated comedic scenario referenced by the dialogue, was becoming the show's most distinctive formal innovation. This was not The Simpsons format. This was something new. Something that reflected a saturated worldview. The cutaway gag would eventually become so associated with their own. Now, here is something that connects directly to modern pop culture in a way that will feel relevant to you right now in 2026. Family Guy. Season 1 is actually one of the earliest examples of a show that built its cultural footprint almost entirely outside of traditional media channels. Before social media existed, before YouTube existed, before any of the platforms we use today to share and discuss content, the Family Guy was spreading through pirated downloads, through DVD copies passed between friends, through people recording episodes on VHS and sharing them. The show built its cult following in the early internet era, through some of the earliest peer-to-peer file sharing technologies. This was genuinely novel at the time. Family Guy was one of the first shows to demonstrate that television audiences could be assembled and maintained outside of traditional broadcast metrics. This history makes it a fascinating precursor to how we consume and share content today. But we need to talk about what happened next, because the story of Family Guy after Season 1 is one of the most dramatic in television history, and it is completely inseparable from understanding why Season 1 matters so much. After the show completed its initial run and moved into subsequent seasons, Fox canceled Family Guy in 2002. Canceled. The show was done. Finished. It was pulled from the schedule and appeared to be gone permanently. By conventional wisdom at the time, that should have been the end of the story. Most canceled shows from that era simply disappeared. Their casts moved on, their creators developed new projects, and audiences found new things to watch. That is the normal trajectory. Family Guy did not follow the normal trajectory. What happened instead was that Adult Swim, the late-night programming block on Cartoon Network, began airing reruns of Family Guy. And something remarkable happened. The ratings for these reruns were extraordinary. A show that Fox had deemed not commercially viable enough to keep on the air was pulling in massive numbers when replayed on a cable channel aimed at young adults watching late at night. This proved something fundamental about Family Guy's audience. The people who loved the show were intensely loyal and would seek it out whenever and wherever it was available. They were not passive viewers who would tune in at whatever time the network told them to. They were active fans who genuinely wanted more of the content. The DVD releases added another dimension to this phenomenon. When Family Guy's seasons became available on DVD, they sold extraordinarily well. These sales provided concrete commercial evidence that there was a substantial audience willing to spend money on this show. And that combination, strong Adult Swim ratings plus strong DVD sales, is what convinced Fox to do something almost unprecedented in television history. They brought Family Guy back. The show was uncanceled and returned to television in 2005, making it one of the very few shows in American television history to be canceled and then genuinely revived because of audience demand. Without Season 1, without those 7 episodes establishing the world and the characters and the voice that would hook a generation of viewers, none of that revival story happens. Season 1 is the foundation that everything else was built on. Now let's get into some of the more specific and surprising details about individual episodes from Season 1, because this is where things get really granular and really interesting for the true fans. The second episode of Season 1, titled I Never Met the Dead Man, features a plot centered on Peter accidentally destroying the town's cable television signal and the Griffin family being forced to find other ways to entertain themselves. What is fascinating about this episode in retrospect is how it functions as a meditation on television dependency and the role of media in family life. For a show that would go on to spend much of its existence commenting on and parodying other television content, this early episode about what happens when television disappears is almost self-aware in an interesting way. The Griffins are genuinely lost without their screen time. And the comedy of the episode comes from their inability to function as a family unit without the mediation of entertainment. It is funnier and smarter than it initially appears. The third episode, Chitty Chitty Death Bang, introduces some genuinely dark comedic territory around Stewie's backstory and his cult connections, and it also includes one of the season's strongest early demonstrations of Meg's role in the family dynamic. Meg, in Season 1, is treated as the overlooked middle child. The teenager whose experiences and feelings are consistently deprioritized by her parents in favor of whatever crisis Peter has created this week. This treatment of Meg would become more extreme and more deliberately cruel as the show progressed. But in Season 1, there is still something almost sympathetic about how her storylines are constructed. She is recognizably a teenager trying to figure out who she is. And the show has some genuine warmth in how it approaches her character in these early episodes. Warmth that would become increasingly complicated in later seasons. Something that genuinely surprises people when they look into the production of Season 1 is how much of the voice cast established in those 7 episodes would remain with the show for its entire subsequent run. Seth MacFarlane himself voices Peter, Stewie, Brian, and Quagmire, which is an extraordinary range for a single performer to maintain across a long-running series. Alex Borstein as Lois, Mila Kunis as Meg, Seth Green as Chris, and Mike Henry in various roles were all present from the beginning. The core cast was fully assembled in Season 1, and that core would hold together through decades of production. This kind of cast stability is genuinely unusual in long-running television, and it speaks to the strength of the creative relationships that were established in those early episodes. When you hear those voices in Season 1, you are hearing the definitive versions of those characters, the voices that would define them forever. Here is a fact about the show's cultural context in 1999 that adds another layer to understanding Season 1. The late 1990s were a specific and interesting moment in American comedy. The culture was digesting years of postmodern irony, of the kind of self-aware humor that had defined so much of the decade's comedy. Shows like Seinfeld had built enormous audiences around detached, ironic characters who treated everything with a certain emotional distance. Family Guy arrived in this context and did something slightly different. It embraced a kind of maximalist absurdism that went beyond irony into something more chaotic and unpredictable. The cutaway gags are not ironic in the traditional sense. They are genuinely weird, genuinely committed to their own internal logic in the moment, and then instantly abandoned. This was a different flavor of postmodern comedy, one that would feel increasingly at home in the internet era that was just beginning to emerge as Season 1 aired. Let me tell you something about the physical production of animated content in 1999 that most people never think about. Animation in the late 1990s was still largely done using traditional methods that required enormous amounts of physical labor. The transition to digital animation was happening but was not yet complete, and shows like Family Guy occupied a complicated middle ground between traditional and digital techniques. The rough quality visible in Season 1 is partly a function of where the technology was at the time, and partly a function of the budget constraints we discussed earlier. When you watch those early episodes, you are seeing animation produced at the very tail end of one era of production and the very beginning of another. It is a historical artifact in its visual style, completely apart from whatever you think about the content. Now, I want to address something that often comes up when people discuss Season 1 in comparison to the later show, and that is the question of how boundaries were being tested, even in those very first episodes. Family Guy, from its very first episode, pushed against what was acceptable on network television in ways that were genuinely provocative for 1999. The show was not operating in the same cultural moment as it would in its post-revival years when it became famous for extreme boundary pushing. In Season 1, the provocations were subtler, but they were present. Jokes that referenced adult themes, humor that relied on the audience being in on something slightly transgressive. A willingness to go to uncomfortable places that most family-friendly animation avoided. This was deliberate. MacFarlane and his team were establishing from day one that this was not a safe show, that it was going to challenge its audience's expectations about what animated comedy could do. One of the most striking things about rewatching Season 1 today is how much the show was already commenting on suburban American life, in ways that feel remarkably consistent across its entire run. Quahog, Rhode Island, the fictional town where the Griffins live, is established in those first 7 episodes as a very specific kind of American place. It is working class but aspirational, economically anxious, socially stratified in ways that everyone pretends do not exist, and full of people who are defined as much by their limitations as by their ambitions. Peter Griffin is not a wealthy man. He is a factory worker, later working in other jobs, but always rooted in a class position that the show takes seriously, even when it is making jokes. The economic reality of the Griffin household is present in Season 1 in ways that give the comedy an edge that pure fantasy settings cannot provide. Brian Griffin's character in Season 1 is worth examining more closely because the choices made in those early episodes about who Brian is would have enormous consequences for everything the character became. Brian is a dog who talks, who drinks martinis, who has pretensions to being a serious writer, who sees himself as more sophisticated and culturally aware than the rest of his family. This is inherently comedic because the gap between Brian's self-image and reality is visible to the audience even when it is not visible to Brian himself. But in Season 1, this gap is handled with a little more subtlety than it would be in later years. Early Brian has genuine moments of insight and genuine moments of connection with other characters that make him sympathetic rather than just a target for jokes about his pretension. The character is more fully human, so to speak, in those early episodes, and that humanity is what made viewers care about him enough for his later development to matter. Let's talk about something that connects Season 1 to the broader landscape of television history in a way that I find genuinely fascinating. The late 1990s were a transitional moment for animation in prime time. The Simpsons had proven the format could work for adults. King of the Hill had demonstrated that animated comedy could be relatively grounded and still find a large audience. South Park had exploded onto cable television and completely redefined what animated comedy could say and do. Family Guy arrived in this context and needed to find its own space within a suddenly crowded landscape. McFarlane's solution was to create something that was simultaneously more pop culture saturated than The Simpsons, more absurdist than King of the Hill, and more willing to go to genuinely dark comedic places while remaining on network television rather than cable. This was a specific and calculated creative positioning, and you can see it in every episode of Season 1. There is a specific creative choice made in Season 1 that almost nobody talks about, but which I think is incredibly important for understanding the show's DNA. The Griffin family is, structurally, a deeply dysfunctional unit. But the dysfunction is never presented as tragic. Unlike some later animated shows that would explore family dysfunction with genuine emotional weight and consequences, Family Guy Season 1 establishes a tone where the chaos is essentially self-contained and self-resetting. Each episode ends with the family essentially intact, no worse for wear, ready to begin the next episode fresh. This is a very specific tonal choice, one that prioritizes comedy over consequence, and it defines the show's relationship with its own universe in a way that separates it from more character development-focused contemporaries. It is a choice that has been both celebrated and criticized over the years, but it was made in Season 1 and it has never really changed. All right, here is one of the most genuinely surprising production facts about Season 1 that I want to make sure you hear clearly. Seth MacFarlane very nearly missed the flight that would have taken him to work on the morning of September 11th, 2001. Now this happened after Season 1, but the fact that MacFarlane was alive to shepherd his show through its complicated early years and eventual revival is something that a lot of people find genuinely striking when they learn it. His survival and continued involvement with the show is one of those historical footnotes that makes you think about how differently things could have gone, not just for MacFarlane personally, but for Family Guy as a franchise and cultural phenomenon. The show's entire post-Season 1 history, the cancellation, the revival, the decades of subsequent episodes, all of it depended on MacFarlane being alive and able to do the work. Let me now circle back to something I touched on earlier about the Super Bowl premiere, because there is a detail here that really illustrates how specific the business decisions around Season 1 were. Fox's choice to premiere Family Guy after Super Bowl 33 was not an accident or a gesture of goodwill toward a promising new show. It was a calculated bet. Fox had a significant financial and creative investment in MacFarlane's project, and they needed to give it the best possible launch conditions. The Super Bowl slot was the biggest possible spotlight they could offer. The fact that they offered it to an animated comedy, a format that was still finding its audience for adults, speaks to how much confidence the network had in what they had seen from MacFarlane's team. That confidence was not entirely validated by the show's subsequent rating struggles, but the initial act of faith represented by that premiere slot is historically significant. Now, as we approach the end of this deep dive, I want to bring everything back to why Season 1 of Family Guy matters today, in 2026, when the show has been on the air for more than 2 decades with breaks and revivals, and has become one of the most globally recognized animated brands in television history. The reason Season 1 matters is that it represents a moment of genuine creative ambition and risk. MacFarlane was a 24-year-old making his first major television project, working with a small team on a limited budget in the shadow of The Simpsons, launching against critical skepticism, trying to establish something that had never quite been done in the way he wanted to do it. Season 1 is the document of that attempt. It is imperfect in all the ways that first seasons of great shows are imperfect. The animation is rougher. Some of the jokes are less precisely calibrated than what the show would eventually produce. Some of the character dynamics are still finding their final form. But the energy of those 7 episodes is irreplaceable. There is something in Season 1 of Family Guy that later seasons, for all their polish and confidence and bigger budgets and more refined storytelling, cannot quite replicate. It is the energy of something being invented in real time, of a creative team discovering what their show is capable of through the actual act of making it. When you watch Death Has a Shadow with that context in mind, you are watching a group of talented people taking a real creative risk, and mostly pulling it off in front of an audience of tens of millions. That is remarkable regardless of what you think about the show's humor or its cultural legacy. Here is my final surprising fact for you, and I think it might be the one that really sticks. If you add up the total runtime of Season 1 of Family Guy, 7 episodes at roughly 22 minutes each, you get less than 3 hours of television. Less than 3 hours of content launched a franchise that has generated billions of dollars, spawned multiple spin-offs, defined the comedic sensibilities of an entire generation, influenced the structure of internet humor in ways that are still being debated, and demonstrated that audience loyalty is a more powerful force than network ratings metrics could ever measure. Less than 3 hours of animated television about a not particularly bright man from Rhode Island and his talking dog and his cartoonishly villainous baby changed the landscape of American comedy. That is not an exaggeration. That is just what happened. So if you have never gone back and watched those first 7 episodes with fresh eyes and the knowledge of everything I have shared with you today, I genuinely think you should. Watch them knowing that Seth MacFarlane was 24 years old. Watch them knowing the critical reception was brutal. Watch them knowing that the show would be canceled, revived, and go on to run for decades. Watch them knowing that Stewie was originally meant to be taken seriously as a villain. Watch them knowing that the cutaway gag format was an innovation, not just a quirk. Watch them knowing that the rough animation you see was produced during a transitional moment in animation technology. Watch them with all of that context and tell me they do not feel different, richer, more interesting than they did before. If this video gave you at least one fact you genuinely did not know, I want to hear about it in the comments. Which one hit you the hardest? Which one are you going to tell your friends about? Because I really do love hearing from people who are as genuinely fascinated by the history of television and pop culture as I am. And if you want more deep dives like this one, more videos that go past the surface level of the things you think you already know, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications because I have got more coming that you are absolutely not going to want to miss. Thanks for being here and I will see you in the next one. Hey, what is going on everybody? Welcome back to the channel. If you are new here, my name is Alex, and we do deep dives into the shows, movies, and pop culture moments that defined our childhoods and honestly, still define us today. And look, I know what you are thinking. You have seen 100 Family Guy videos, you have seen the clip compilations, you have seen the top 10 lists, you have seen the reaction videos. But I promise you, what we are doing today is something different. We are going in. We are going deep. We are talking about one of the most underrated and genuinely fascinating seasons in the entire run of the show. And I am talking about Season 4 of Family Guy. Now buckle up, because some of these facts are going to completely change how you watch these episodes. Before we get into it, I need to ask you something. How many of you actually know that Season 4 almost did not happen the way we know it? Because the whole context around this season is wild, and we are going to get into all of that. Stick around because I have saved the absolute craziest facts for the end of this video, and trust me, you do not want to miss them. Drop a comment right now if you are a Family Guy fan. I want to know your favorite season because that debate is always fire in the comments section. All right, let us set the stage. Family Guy had been canceled by Fox. The show was done. It was over. They pulled the plug after Season 3, and for a while it genuinely seemed like the Griffin family was just going to fade into television history. But then something incredible happened, and this is really where Season 4 gets its entire identity from. Adult Swim picked up the reruns, started airing the old episodes, and the ratings were absolutely through the roof. People were watching in massive numbers, DVD sales went crazy, and Fox executives suddenly realized they had made a potentially massive mistake. The show was brought back, and Season 4 premiered in 2005, making Family Guy one of the very few animated shows in television history to get canceled and then successfully return. That context is everything when you are watching Season 4 because you can feel in the writing that the creators were energized, they were hungry, and they had something to prove. The whole season has this electricity to it that you can really sense if you pay attention. Now here is the first fact that I think is genuinely mind-blowing if you are a real fan of the show. The episode Stewie Loves Lois, which opened the 4th season, was not just a fun episode about Stewie developing an unusual attachment to his mother. It was also a very deliberate creative statement. Seth MacFarlane and the writers wanted to show audiences that the show had evolved during its time off the air. The dynamic between Stewie and Lois in the earlier seasons was almost entirely defined by Stewie wanting to kill her. That was basically the whole joke for a long time. But in Season 4, they started exploring something more layered and, honestly, more interesting. Stewie is still chaotic and still absolutely unhinged in the best possible way. But there is this vulnerability introduced that makes him feel like a more complete character. The show used its comeback to intentionally deepen the characters rather than just doing the same thing that worked before. And that creative decision is honestly what separates great television from mediocre television. Let us talk about Peter Griffin for a second because Season 4 is arguably where Peter becomes the version of Peter that most people think of when they picture the character today. In the earlier seasons, Peter was definitely funny, but he was a bit more of a straightforward, bumbling dad archetype. By Season 4, the writers had really leaned into making Peter this force of nature, this unstoppable chaos engine who somehow stumbles through life and always ends up more or less okay. There is a confidence in the writing around Peter in Season 4 that you can feel. The jokes land harder, the physical comedy is more committed, and the pop culture references feel more deliberately chosen rather than just thrown in. True, Peter Griffin in Season 4 is Peter Griffin at the height of his comedic power in a lot of ways. Okay, here's something that a lot of casual fans do not know. Season 4 is when the show really started leaning into what would become its signature style of cutaway humor in a much more structured and intentional way. Now the cutaway gag had been part of Family Guy from the beginning, but in Season 4, the writers started treating these cutaways almost like short films within the episode. Some of them are 30 seconds, some of them are a minute and a half, and the quality of the writing inside those cutaways got noticeably sharper. The writers' room reportedly had intense debates about which cutaways to include and which to cut, and a lot of material that was written for Season 4 never made it into the show. Think about all the incredible stuff that aired and then imagine there was even more that got left on the cutting room floor. That is both exciting and a little heartbreaking, honestly. Now I want to talk about the episode Don't Make Me Over because this one is fascinating from a production standpoint. This was the first new episode of Family Guy to air after the revival, not counting the season premiere in terms of fan reception, and it got enormous attention. The episode centers on Meg getting a makeover and becoming temporarily popular, which is a pretty classic sitcom premise. But Family Guy takes it in directions that a standard sitcom absolutely would not go. What is interesting is that the writers were very aware of how much scrutiny this episode was going to receive. They knew people were watching to see if the show still had it after being off the air for years, and they were essentially writing under a microscope. The fact that they delivered something genuinely funny and memorable under that kind of pressure says a lot about the strength of the team they had assembled. Let me hit you with a casting fact that is pretty wild. Season 4 is full of incredible guest appearances, and the show managed to pull in some seriously impressive names. The guest casting in this season was on another level, partly because the show's revival had generated so much buzz that celebrities were genuinely excited to be involved. Being on Family Guy had transformed from being a quirky niche thing into being a legitimate pop culture moment. Some of the guest voices in Season 4 include people who you would not necessarily expect to show up in an animated comedy. and the range of those appearances tells you a lot about how the show's reputation had shifted during its time away from television. Here is a fact about the writing process that I find absolutely fascinating. The Family Guy writer's room in Season 4 operated on a system where any writer could pitch any joke for any scene, regardless of whose episode it was. This is a collaborative approach that sounds chaotic, but apparently worked incredibly well for this show specifically. MacFarlane has talked about how the nature of Family Guy's humor, with its rapid-fire references and its willingness to go absolutely anywhere, I required a room full of people who were all deeply knowledgeable about pop culture, film, television history, and just weird, obscure stuff in general. The writers were essentially competing with each other in the best possible way, trying to out-reference and out-funny each other. And the episodes that resulted from that environment have this density of jokes that rewards repeated viewing. You catch something new every time you watch a Season 4 episode, and that is not an accident. That is the direct result of 20 or 30 writers all bringing their absolute best material to every single episode. All right, let us talk about Petarded, which is one of the most controversial episodes in not just Season 4, but the entire run of the show. This is the episode where Peter discovers through a trivia game that he has a surprisingly low IQ, and the episode follows what happens when he legally qualifies for certain protections based on that discovery. The episode was polarizing when it aired, and honestly, it is still polarizing today. But what is interesting from a production standpoint is that the writers apparently debated this concept for a long time before committing to it. There were real concerns internally about whether the premise was going to land the way they wanted it to. And there were multiple rewrites before the final version. The episode that aired is actually significantly different from the original pitch. And the evolution of that episode through the writing process is a great example of how comedy writing is much more thoughtful and deliberate than it might appear on the surface. Now, here is something that connects to a bigger trend in Season 4 that I think is worth appreciating. The season has a surprisingly emotional undercurrent running through it that I do not think gets talked about enough. For all the chaos and the offensive jokes and the wild cutaways, Season 4 has some genuinely touching moments scattered throughout. The relationship between Brian and Stewie, which would eventually become one of the most beloved dynamics in the show's entire history, really starts developing its emotional depth in Season 4. You start to see glimpses of a genuine friendship forming between this alcoholic talking dog and this evil genius baby, and those glimpses are genuinely sweet in a way that sneaks up on you. Brian and Stewie in Season 4 are kind of like two outcasts who have found each other, and that is unexpectedly moving when you think about it. Let us get into some pure trivia now, because some of this stuff is just delightfully random. Season 4 features the debut of several characters and running gags that would become absolutely central to the show's identity going forward. The season was essentially building a mythology in real time, adding layers to the world of Quahog that would pay off in later seasons. The writers were planting seeds in Season 4 without necessarily knowing which ones would grow into full storylines, which is actually a pretty common approach in long-running television but feels especially apparent in this particular season when you watch it with fresh eyes. The animation in Season 4 is also worth talking about because it represents a genuine leap forward from the earlier episodes. During the years the show was off the air, animation technology had continued advancing, and when Family Guy came back, it came back looking noticeably crisper and more polished. The character movements are smoother, the backgrounds are more detailed, and the action sequences, particularly the ones involving Stewie's weapons and gadgets, have a more cinematic quality to them. The show had a bigger budget in Season 4, partly because Fox was very motivated to make the revival a success, and that money shows on screen in ways that maybe viewers did not consciously notice, but definitely felt on some level. Here is a behind-the-scenes fact that I genuinely love. Seth MacFarlane reportedly watched an enormous number of classic Hollywood films and old television shows during the years Family Guy was off the air, and a lot of that material found its way into Season 4 in the form of references and parodies. MacFarlane's love of classic entertainment, particularly the golden age of Hollywood musicals and variety shows, has always been a part of his creative DNA, but it feels especially present in Season 4. There are moments in this season where the show essentially becomes a loving tribute to entertainment styles that most of its audience had never experienced firsthand. And MacFarlane was essentially introducing those styles to a whole generation through the filter of a completely insane animated comedy. That is actually kind of a beautiful thing when you think about it. Now let us talk about one of the most famous episodes from this season, which is the episode titled The Cleveland Loretta Quagmire. For people who may not remember, this episode deals with Cleveland discovering that his wife Loretta has been having an affair with Quagmire, and it is one of the more dramatically intense episodes in the show's history up to that point. What is fascinating about this episode is how the writers managed to play it mostly straight emotionally while still delivering on the comedy that audiences expected. Cleveland's reaction to the betrayal feels genuinely painful, in a way that sitcom storytelling often avoids because it is uncomfortable. But Family Guy leaned into it. This episode led directly to the spin-off Cleveland show several years later. So in a very real sense, this Season 4 episode planted the seed for an entirely separate television show. That is a pretty remarkable legacy for a single episode to carry. Let me tell you something about the music in Season 4 that I think deserves way more attention. Family Guy has always been a show that uses music brilliantly, and Season 4 is arguably where that musicality reached its peak during this era of the show. The original songs written for Season 4 episodes are genuinely clever pieces of comedy writing in their own right. Writing a funny song that also moves a plot forward and also reveals character is an incredibly difficult creative task, and the show made it look effortless in this season. Some of the musical moments from Season 4 have taken on lives of their own outside the show and are still referenced and shared by fans today, which tells you something about how they were crafted. Good comedy music is actually hard to write, and the team behind Family Guy Season 4 was really firing on all cylinders in this department. Okay, here is a fact that connects to the broader television landscape of 2005 and 2006. Season 4 was airing at a time when animated adult comedies were having a real moment. The Simpsons was still going strong, South Park was entering what many consider its creative peak, and Futurama was also making noise. Family Guy's revival dropped right into the middle of this environment and had to establish itself as something distinct. The writers were very aware of the competition and very aware that critics were ready to write the show off as derivative or shock-driven. Season 4 is in many ways a direct response to those criticisms, a season that is saying, look at how much we can do, look at how many different emotional registers we can hit. So, look at how ambitious this storytelling actually is underneath all the chaos. Whether or not it fully succeeded in changing critical opinion is debatable, but the ambition is real, and you can feel it throughout the season. Here is something I want to get into about Quagmire's character in Season 4, because his arc across this season is really interesting. Glenn Quagmire is one of those characters who could easily be one-dimensional, and in earlier seasons he sometimes was. But Season 4 starts giving him more complexity, and you can see the writers figuring out that Quagmire is actually more interesting when he has genuine emotional responses to things, rather than just being the punchline to every inappropriate joke. The Cleveland Loretta episode is the most obvious example of this, but there are smaller moments scattered through Season 4 where Quagmire shows genuine humanity, and those moments make the character more compelling overall. It is the difference between a character being funny and a character being someone you actually care about, and Season 4 starts walking that line with Quagmire in a way the show had not really done before. Let me pivot to talking about Meg in Season 4, because I think Meg's treatment in this season is worth examining closely. Meg Griffin is one of the most interesting characters in Family Guy from a writing perspective because she exists as a lightning rod for the show's darker comedic impulses. The running joke about the family treating Meg poorly reaches new heights in Season 4, and the writers were clearly having a lot of fun with how far they could push this premise. But what is interesting is that Season 4 also gives Meg moments of genuine pathos and relatability. She is not just a punching bag in this season. She is also occasionally the most normal person in a family full of absolute lunatics, and the show acknowledges that in ways that are actually kind of sympathetic toward her. Now here is a production fact that blew my mind when I first learned about it. The average Family Guy episode, including in Season 4, takes somewhere between 8 and 10 months to produce from the initial writing stage to the final delivered episode. When you watch a 22-minute episode of Family Guy and laugh at a joke that seems effortless, that joke has been through multiple rounds of script notes, recording sessions, animatic reviews, animation production, post-production sound, and final quality checks. The spontaneity and looseness that makes Family Guy funny is entirely manufactured through a very long and very detailed process. The jokes that feel like they were just thrown in randomly are often the product of weeks of debate and refinement. That knowledge does not make the show less funny, but it gives you a deep appreciation for the craft involved. All right, I promised you some truly wild facts, and here we go. There is an episode in Season 4 called Jungle Love, where Peter ends up taking Chris to what is supposed to be a music festival, but things go completely sideways in the most Family Guy way possible. The episode features some musical performances that were genuinely ambitious for an animated show to pull off, and the production team had to solve some real technical and creative challenges to make those sequences work the way they did. The episode also has a subplot that was almost cut entirely in a late-stage revision but ended up being kept in after test screenings showed that audiences responded really strongly to it. What stays and what gets cut in television production is often less about quality and more about timing and instinct, and the fact that this subplot nearly disappeared is a good reminder of how much great television nearly does not exist. Here is something about Seth MacFarlane himself in Season 4 that I think is fascinating. MacFarlane voices 4 of the main characters on the show, which is an absolutely staggering vocal performance commitment. Peter, Stewie, Brian, and Quagmire are all MacFarlane, and in Season 4, as the show was ramping back up, he was recording all of these characters while also running the show as creator and executive producer. The stamina and creative bandwidth required to do all of that simultaneously is almost hard to comprehend. And what is remarkable is that the characters never bleed into each other vocally. They are all completely distinct, and MacFarlane maintains those distinctions, episode after episode. The voice work in Season 4 is some of the best of the entire series run, and that is not something that happens automatically. That is years of craft and dedication paying off. Let us talk about the episode Blind Ambition, because this one has a really interesting cultural dimension to it. The episode involves Peter trying to get on a reality show in a storyline that was clearly playing with the explosion of reality television that was happening in American culture at that exact moment. Season 4 aired right in the middle of the peak reality TV era, when shows about people competing for prizes or being filmed doing various things were absolutely everywhere, and Family Guy's commentary on that cultural moment is sharp and specific. The episode is funny on its own terms, but it is also a document of a particular moment in American pop culture history, and watching it now gives it an almost nostalgic quality that it did not have when it originally aired. Here is a fact about the international reception of Season 4 that I find genuinely interesting. Family Guy has always had a complicated relationship with different international markets, because the show's humor is so deeply rooted in American cultural references that it can be challenging to translate. Season 4, being one of the most reference-dense seasons in the show's history, faced some real challenges in international distribution. Some jokes simply do not translate, some references have no equivalent in other cultural contexts, and some of the comedy is built on assumptions about American institutions and experiences that audiences in other countries just do not share. The solutions that the international teams came up with varied wildly from market to market, and some of the translated or adapted versions of Season 4 episodes are genuinely fascinating objects in their own right. All right. We are heading toward the end of the season recap here, and I want to make sure we talk about what is arguably the most ambitious episode of Season 4, and possibly one of the most ambitious episodes in the show's entire history. Without getting too deep into spoilers for those of you who are planning to rewatch, there is a late Season 4 episode that essentially throws out the normal rules of how Family Guy episodes work and does something completely structurally different. The episode drew enormous attention when it aired and remains one of the most discussed episodes among serious fans of the show. What is remarkable about it is that the writers clearly knew they were taking a big swing, And the episode succeeds or fails for different viewers based entirely on whether they are willing to go on that particular ride. The fact that the show tried it at all, especially in a season where they were already under enormous pressure to justify the revival, says everything about the creative confidence of the team. One more thing I want to mention before we get to the really juicy final facts. Season 4 has an episode called Breaking Out is Hard to Do, where Lois gets addicted to shoplifting, and this episode is a masterclass in how to escalate a comedy premise. The episode starts with a relatively grounded situation, Lois shoplifting something small on a whim, and then keeps building and building until it reaches a conclusion that is absolutely insane, but feels completely logical given everything that came before it. This kind of escalation structure is actually really hard to write well, and a lot of comedy shows fall apart in the escalation because they either go too far too fast or they do not commit hard enough at the end. Family Guy Season 4 figures out the pacing of escalation in this episode in a way that feels textbook perfect. And it is honestly worth studying if you are interested in comedy writing as a craft. Here is the fact I have been building toward this entire video, the one that I think really puts Season 4 in its proper context. When you look at the history of television revivals, shows that got canceled and came back, the track record is genuinely not great. Most shows that come back after cancellation either try too hard to recapture what made them popular the first time and end up feeling stale, or they try to reinvent themselves too dramatically and lose what made them special. Season 4 of Family Guy somehow managed to do neither of those things. It came back feeling both familiar and evolved, both nostalgic and forward-looking, both true to what the show had always been and genuinely new. That balance is almost impossibly hard to strike, and the fact that Family Guy hit it on the very first season back is remarkable. It is the main reason Season 4 holds such a special place in the hearts of fans who were there for the original run and then experienced the revival. Season 4 also directly demonstrated to the television industry that audience loyalty can survive cancellation, that home video and syndication can build or rebuild an audience, and that networks should pay closer attention to data about what audiences are actually watching rather than just relying on traditional ratings metrics. The return of Family Guy changed how television executives thought about canceled shows, and the ripple effects of that have been felt throughout the industry ever since. Every show that has ever been saved by fan campaigns, by streaming data, by DVD sales figures, every one of those stories exists in the shadow of what Family Guy Season 4 proved was possible. The writers knew all of this context when they were making Season 4. They knew they were writing something that was historically significant in addition to being a comedy show, and that awareness pushed them to be better. It pushed them to take risks they might not have taken in a normal season, to go for the big swings, to try the ambitious ideas, to not play it safe. And the result is a season of television that is funny and chaotic and weird, and sometimes uncomfortable and occasionally surprisingly moving and absolutely worth watching or rewatching today. So there you have it. Random facts about Family Guy Season 4 that hopefully gave you a new appreciation for what that season was, what it meant, and why it still matters. I want to know in the comments which fact surprised you the most. Was it the production timeline? Was it the behind-the-scenes stuff about the writer's room? Was it the stuff about how the revival changed the television industry? Drop it down below. I read every single comment. And if you want more content like this, we do deep dives on animated shows, live-action classics, films, all of it. Hit that subscribe button if you have not already. It genuinely helps the channel more than you know. Hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, and share it with a fellow Family Guy fan who needs to see it. I will see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and as always, stay curious. All right, let me tell you something wild. You think you know Family Guy? You think you sat through every single episode of Season 5, caught every joke, noticed every background detail, picked up on every single thing the writers snuck in there? I promise you, you did not. I have been down a rabbit hole so deep on this season that I genuinely lost track of time. And what I found is going to completely change how you look at some of the most iconic episodes ever made. So buckle up because we are about to go through some genuinely insane facts about Family Guy Season 5 that most people have never heard before. Before we get into it, I just want to say that Season 5 holds a very specific place in the hearts of Family Guy fans. This was the show at the peak of its confidence. The writers had already proved themselves. The characters had settled into who they were. And the creative team was pushing boundaries in ways that honestly television had never really seen before. This was the season where Family Guy stopped just being a funny cartoon and started being something that people genuinely talked about the morning after it aired. And when you start digging into what actually went on behind the scenes, in the writing room, in the animation process, in the decisions that got made about specific jokes and storylines, the whole thing gets even more interesting. So let us start with something that sets the tone for this entire season. The 5th season of Family Guy premiered on September 10th, 2006. Now that seems like a simple enough piece of information, but what makes it fascinating is the context around it. The show had already come back from cancellation once at this point. Fox had canceled Family Guy in 2002 after 3 seasons. And it came back in 2005 due to incredible DVD sales and strong ratings on Adult Swim. So by the time season 5 rolled around, Seth MacFarlane and his team were operating with a very different kind of energy. They were not just making a show, they were making a statement. They were proving that they belonged back on television, and that attitude bleeds into every single episode of this season in a way that you can absolutely feel when you watch it. Now here is something that a lot of people either do not know or have completely forgotten. Season 5 is the season that gave us the episode Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie, which was a 2-part storyline that actually aired as the season finale and then the season premiere of season 6. The production of these 2 episodes was treated with an almost movie level of seriousness by the creative team. The writers spent an enormous amount of time figuring out how to make both outcomes feel genuinely surprising while also being internally consistent with the characters. The animators put extra work into specific sequences that were designed to feel more cinematic than a typical Family Guy episode. When you watch those episodes back knowing that information, you start noticing things that you might have glossed over before. The lighting choices in certain scenes, the way specific camera angles are framed. There is a level of craft in those episodes that goes beyond what the show usually did. Let us talk about something a little more unexpected. The episode titled Chick Cancer, which is season 5, episode 7, contains what many people consider to be one of the most technically ambitious musical numbers in the history of the show up to that point. The production of that sequence involved a significant amount of coordination between the writers, the music department, and the animation team. What most people do not realize is that musical numbers in animated television are not written and produced the way you might imagine. The music typically gets recorded first, then the animation gets created to match it, which means the comedic timing of every single visual gag in a musical sequence has to be locked in before the animators even start drawing. The team working on season 5 had become incredibly skilled at this process, and it shows in how tight and precise those moments feel. Here is a fact that absolutely blew my mind when I first came across it. Seth MacFarlane does the voices of Peter Griffin, Stewie Griffin, Brian Griffin, and Quagmire, among others. That is pretty well known at this point, but what is less talked about is the sheer recording demand that a season like season 5 placed on him. He was not just the lead voice actor, he was also the showrunner and one of the primary writers. There were days during the production of season 5 where Seth MacFarlane would spend hours in the recording booth doing voice work, then transition directly into writing meetings or editing sessions. The creative output required to maintain that level of involvement across an entire season of television is genuinely staggering when you think about it. And the fact that the quality of the show remained as high as it did throughout the season speaks to something remarkable about how that team operated. Okay, here is one that is going to get the real fans excited. The episode called Road to Rupert, which is season 5, episode 2, continues the Road to tradition that the show had been developing since the Road to Rhode Island episode back in season 2. These Road to episodes were always treated as special productions within the show. And Road to Rupert was no exception. The episode follows Stewie and Brian on a road trip to Aspen, Colorado to recover Stewie's stuffed animal Rupert after Peter accidentally sells him at a yard sale. What makes this episode fascinating from a production standpoint is how the writers balanced the comedic elements with genuine character development for Stewie and Brian. The dynamic between those two characters was something the creative team was very deliberately nurturing across this season, laying groundwork for emotional payoffs that would come later. Something worth noting about Family Guy Season 5 that does not get discussed nearly enough is the show's approach to celebrity cameos and references during this period. By Season 5, the show had developed a very specific philosophy about how to use celebrity appearances and references. Rather than simply putting a celebrity in an episode to generate buzz, the writers were much more interested in subverting expectations and using celebrity culture as a target for satire. Some of the references and cameos that appeared throughout Season 5 were planned months in advance with very specific comedic goals in mind. The writer's room for Family Guy was known for being a place where ideas got challenged and stress-tested before they made it onto the screen, and that process really shows in how layered some of the jokes from this season are. Now I want to talk about something that gets into the technical side of animation because I think it adds a whole new dimension to appreciating this season. By the time Season 5 was in production, the animation pipeline for Family Guy had become significantly more sophisticated than it was in the early seasons. The show uses a combination of traditional seal animation techniques and digital tools, and the team had spent years refining how those two approaches could work together. One of the things this allowed them to do in Season 5 was execute cutaway gags with more visual complexity than had been possible earlier in the show's run. Some of the more elaborate fantasy sequences and parody scenes from Season 5 episodes required coordination between multiple animation teams working in parallel, and the results are visible in how polished those moments look, compared to some of the rougher edges you can sometimes see in the earlier seasons. Let me drop another fact that I genuinely did not expect to find. The episode titled No Meals on Wheels is Season 5, Episode 14, and it deals with Peter opening a restaurant called McBurgertown out of the Griffin home. What makes this episode interesting from a behind-the-scenes perspective is that the premise originally went through several completely different versions before arriving at the version that aired. The writing team at Family Guy was known for a process of developing multiple directions for an episode premise before settling on the one that gave them the most comedic and narrative opportunities. The restaurant premise apparently provided so many different comedic avenues that the writers had a difficult time narrowing down which jokes and storylines to prioritize. The version of the episode that ended up airing represents only a fraction of the material that was developed for it. Here is something that connects to a broader truth about how this season worked. Season 5 of Family Guy is notable for how it handled continuity. Now, if you are a long-time viewer of the show, you know that Family Guy is not exactly famous for strict episode-to-episode continuity. Characters age inconsistently, events from one episode are sometimes ignored in others, and the show generally prioritizes the joke over narrative consistency. But Season 5 actually made some deliberate choices about which character developments to carry forward and which ones to treat as isolated incidents. The ongoing development of Stewie's relationship with Brian is the clearest example of this. Across the season, you can trace a through line in how those two characters interact that feels intentional in a way that reflects careful decisions being made in the writer's room about what the show's emotional core should be. All right. I promised you some facts that would genuinely surprise you, so let me get into one that I think is going to land differently than you expect. The Season 5 episode called Peter's Two Dads, which is Episode 10, digs into the question of Peter's actual biological father. This episode involves some of the most personal writing in the entire season, according to people who have discussed the creative process around it. The theme of fatherhood and identity is something that resonated with multiple people in the writer's room, and it shows in how the emotional beats of the episode are constructed. There is a sincerity underneath the comedy in that episode that feels different from a lot of Family Guy content, and it is not accidental. The writers were deliberately reaching for something that would connect with viewers on a level beyond just making them laugh. Something that gets overlooked when people talk about Family Guy Season 5 is the role of the supporting cast. Characters like Cleveland, Joe, and Quagmire had been part of the show since the beginning, but Season 5 made some specific choices about how to use them that shaped what those characters became going forward. Quagmire in particular was given material in Season 5 that added complexity to a character who had previously been used mostly as a one-note joke delivery vehicle. The writers were testing different versions of who these supporting characters could be, and some of what they found in Season 5 directly influenced the spin-off shows and character-focused episodes that came later. Let me give you a fact about the production timeline that adds some interesting context. When Family Guy Season 5 was being made, the production team was simultaneously dealing with the ongoing development of American Dad, which was Seth MacFarlane's other show on Fox. Managing 2 animated television series simultaneously is an enormous undertaking, and there were constant decisions being made about which creative resources went where. The fact that Season 5 of Family Guy is as strong as it is when you consider the competing demands on the creative team is genuinely impressive. Some people in the animation industry consider this period to be one of the most productive stretches in the history of Seth MacFarlane's career, precisely because of how much quality work was being produced under those conditions. Here is one that is going to get the internet arguing, which I love. The episode titled Barely Legal, Season 5, Episode 8, is one of the most discussed episodes of the entire season from a content and tone perspective. This episode involves Meg Griffin developing a disturbing obsession with Brian after he takes her to the prom, and it pushed the show into territory that even by Family Guy standards felt transgressive. What is interesting about this episode from a writing perspective is how it handled Meg's character. Meg Griffin has always been the show's punching bag, the character whose misery exists primarily to be laughed at. But Barely Legal, while certainly playing some of those same notes, also gave Meg a kind of desperate emotional honesty that the writers did not typically bring to her storylines. It was a strange combination of uncomfortable comedy and genuine character work, and it is one of the reasons Season 5 feels different from the seasons that came before it. Now, here is something about the music of Season 5, because the music in Family Guy is so much more carefully crafted than most people realize. The show has always had an unusually sophisticated musical component for an animated comedy, and Season 5 elevated this even further. The music team for Family Guy during this period was responsible not just for original compositions, but also for the elaborate parody arrangements that show up throughout the season. When Family Guy takes a well-known piece of music and turns it into a comedic moment, that is not as simple as it sounds. The arrangements have to be close enough to the original to trigger recognition in the viewer, but different enough to serve the comedic purpose of the scene. Getting that balance right requires real musical skill, and the team working on Family Guy Season 5 was exceptionally good at it. I want to circle back to something about Seth MacFarlane that I think adds real depth to your understanding of this season. By Season 5, MacFarlane had developed a very clear philosophy about what Family Guy was supposed to be doing. He was on the record in various interviews during this period talking about the show's relationship to classic Hollywood entertainment, particularly old musicals and the kind of comedy that was popular in the 50s and 60s. MacFarlane genuinely loves that era of entertainment, and his attempt to bring some of those sensibilities into a modern animated show that was simultaneously pushing boundaries with edgy and transgressive humor creates a very specific tension that defines Family Guy at its best. Season 5 is probably the clearest expression of that tension in the entire run of the show. You can watch an episode from Season 5 and see moments of genuine, old-school charm sitting right next to jokes that would have been considered completely untouchable anywhere else on television. Let me throw another interesting production fact at you. The animation of Family Guy is handled by multiple studios, with the primary production handled domestically but significant portions of the actual animation work done overseas, which is standard practice for American animated television. What makes Family Guy interesting in this context is how the creative team maintained quality control across that distributed production process. By Season 5, the oversight systems that had been developed for the show were working extremely well, which is part of why the visual consistency of the season is so high. Some earlier episodes of Family Guy have a slightly inconsistent look between scenes that reflects the challenges of that distributed production model. But by Season 5, those issues had been largely ironed out. Okay, here is one that I find genuinely fascinating from a cultural standpoint. Season 5 of Family Guy aired during a very specific moment in American popular culture. 2006 and 2007 were years when the landscape of television comedy was changing rapidly. Reality television was at the peak of its cultural dominance. The internet was beginning to reshape how people discovered and talked about entertainment, but had not yet fully disrupted the traditional television model. Family Guy existed right at this interesting intersection where it was still primarily a television show in the traditional sense, but was also developing a second life online through clips and discussions that were happening on early video sharing platforms and forums. The writers were aware of this, and it influenced how certain jokes were constructed during Season 5, with some gags designed to be funny in the context of the episode, but also to work as standalone moments that could be shared and repeated. Here is a fact about the writing room that I think every creative person is going to find interesting. Family Guy has always been known for its large writer's room, which is somewhat unusual for an animated show. But many animated comedies operate with smaller creative teams. But Family Guy brought in a significant number of writers who came from very different backgrounds. Some had experience in traditional sitcoms, others came from sketch comedy, some were primarily known for their theatrical writing. This diversity of influences is part of what gives Family Guy its distinctive texture, where you will get a joke that feels like it belongs in a classic sketch comedy show, immediately followed by something that is almost surrealist in its construction. Season 5 is a particularly good example of how that mix of influences produced something genuinely unpredictable. Let me talk about an episode that I think is underrated in discussions of this season. The episode called Hell Comes to Quahog. Season 5, Episode 3, 2, involves a megastore called Superstore USA coming to Quahog and putting Peter out of a job at the shipping company. What makes this episode interesting is how it engages with economic and cultural anxieties about corporate consolidation and the death of small-town commerce. Family Guy was never a show that wore its social commentary on its sleeve the way something like South Park did. But Season 5 in particular has a number of episodes where the satirical underpinning is more coherent and pointed than the show usually attempted. Hell Comes to Quahog is a good example of this. There is a real idea at the center of that episode that the comedy grows out of rather than simply existing alongside. Something I want to make sure we talk about is the character of Stewie Griffin and how Season 5 handled him specifically. Stewie had gone through some evolution between the early seasons and Season 5. In the early episodes, Stewie was primarily a one-note joke machine, built around the premise of an evil baby with world domination plans. By Season 5, the writers had moved away from that somewhat, developing Stewie as a more emotionally complex character with a specific and strange relationship to his own identity. Season 5 pushed this even further. And you can see the seeds of some of the most interesting Stewie storylines from later in the show's run being planted here. The writers were clearly interested in exploring what happened when you took this character who had been defined by one particular joke and asked deeper questions about who he actually was. Alright, here's a random fact that I love purely for how absurd it is. The amount of research that goes into Family Guy's historical and pop culture references is genuinely significant. The writer's room maintained extensive files of reference material that writers could draw on when constructing jokes. Some of the most obscure references that show up in Season 5 episodes required real research to get right, because the joke only works if the detail is accurate. There is a specific kind of comedy that Family Guy does where the humor comes partly from the specificity of the reference, and that specificity requires someone in the room to actually know their stuff. By Season 5, the research infrastructure that supported that kind of joke had become quite well developed. Let me give you something that connects the dots between Season 5 and the broader legacy of the show. Season 5 of Family Guy is frequently cited by fans and critics as one of the high points of the entire series run. If you look at ratings data and critical discussions from that period, you can see that the show was operating at a level of cultural relevance during Season 5 that it has struggled to consistently recapture since. Part of this is simply the nature of long-running television shows, which tend to have a peak creative period and then find themselves in the difficult position of trying to maintain quality while the creative team exhausts their best ideas. But part of it is also that Season 5 represented a very specific confluence of factors that was difficult to replicate. The creative team was firing on all cylinders. The show had the benefit of having come back from cancellation and was motivated to prove itself. And the cultural moment was exactly right for what Family Guy was doing. Here is one more production fact that I think you will find surprising. The sound design on Family Guy is something that gets almost no attention in discussions of the show, but it is absolutely crucial to how the comedy works. The specific choices about sound effects, the timing of audio cues, and the way music is used to punctuate jokes all contribute enormously to whether a given moment is actually funny or falls flat. The sound team for Family Guy during Season 5 had developed an extremely precise vocabulary for how to use sound to maximize comedic impact. Some of the most satisfying moments from Season 5 episodes, the ones where a joke just lands perfectly, owe as much to the sound design choices as to the writing or the performance. Now I want to get into something that touches on the show's relationship with its own continuity and mythology in a way that I think is genuinely interesting. Season 5 contains several episodes that function as what you might call mythology-building episodes, where the writers were laying foundations for aspects of the Family Guy universe that would be explored more deeply later. The two-part Stewie kills Lois and Lois kills Stewie storyline is the most obvious example. But there are subtler instances throughout the season where the writers were clearly thinking about the long game for specific characters and storylines. This kind of forward thinking was somewhat unusual for a show that had traditionally operated on a much more episodic basis, and it reflects the growing ambition of the creative team as they settled into their position as one of the most important shows on Fox's animation block. Let me drop one more fact that I think will genuinely surprise some of you. The table reads for Family Guy episodes, which are the initial read-throughs of scripts with the full cast, were known to be quite lengthy and involved. Scripts would frequently be significantly altered between the table read and the final recorded version based on what worked and what did not work when the words were actually being spoken aloud by the actors. Season 5 in particular went through significant rewrites at the table read stage for several episodes. Some jokes that made it through the writing process were cut entirely during table reads because they did not land the way the writers expected, and some moments that became iconic in the final versions were actually added during or after table reads because an actor's delivery of something improvised or slightly adjusted was funnier than what had originally been written. There is something I want to say about Brian Griffin specifically because Brian is one of the most interesting characters in Season 5. Brian is the show's self-insert intellectual, the character who allows the writers to engage with ideas about culture, literature, and identity in a way that would feel out of place coming from Peter or Stewie. Season 5 used Brian in ways that were more emotionally honest than the show had previously attempted, giving him storylines that interrogated his pretensions and his failures in a way that was simultaneously comedic and a little bit sad. The writers were clearly interested in using Brian to explore something about the particular kind of person who considers himself more enlightened than the people around him, but consistently fails to live up to his own ideals. That is rich comedic and dramatic territory, and Season 5 dug into it with real commitment. Here is a fascinating detail about how specific episodes from Season 5 were marketed and promoted. Fox's promotional strategy for Family Guy during this period was very much focused on the edgier and more provocative elements of the show, because those were the aspects that generated the most discussion and controversy. But what is interesting is that some of the promotional material for Season 5 episodes actually undersold what those episodes were doing creatively. Some of the most technically and emotionally ambitious work in the season was packaged as straightforward shock comedy in promotional materials, which meant that some viewers came in expecting one thing and got something considerably more interesting. This disconnect between how the show was marketed and what it was actually doing is part of what makes Season 5 such an interesting object of study. I want to wrap this up by zooming out and talking about what Season 5 of Family Guy means in the larger picture of animated television. The show arrived back from cancellation with something to prove, and Season 5 represents the fullest expression of what it proved. It demonstrated that an animated comedy for adults could sustain a level of creative ambition over an entire season, could balance outrageous comedy with genuine character work, could be both proudly lowbrow and surprisingly sophisticated within the same episode, or even the same scene. That combination is genuinely difficult to pull off, and Family Guy Season 5 pulled it off more consistently than almost any other season of the show. The people who made this season were working at the intersection of enormous commercial pressure, genuine creative ambition, and the very specific freedom that comes from knowing your audience trusts you. No. Every one of these facts we have talked about today points to the same underlying truth, which is that the thing you watched and laughed at and quoted to your friends was the result of an enormous amount of careful, deliberate creative work. The jokes that seemed thrown off and random were usually the product of long discussions and multiple rewrites. The character moments that hit you somewhere unexpected were the result of writers who understood those characters deeply enough to find the genuine emotion underneath the comedy. That is what makes Family Guy Season 5 worth going back to and worth thinking about seriously. Not just as a collection of funny moments, though it absolutely is that, but as the work of a group of genuinely talented people who were operating at the peak of their abilities and who produced something that has stayed in the cultural conversation for almost 2 decades since it first aired. The next time you sit down to watch one of these episodes, I want you to keep some of these facts in your head. Notice the sound design. Pay attention to how the musical moments are constructed. Think about the balance between the shock comedy and the genuine character work. Hey, you are going to see this season completely differently, and honestly, that feels like exactly the right reward for going down this particular rabbit hole together. If you made it to the end of this, first of all, thank you, because this was a deep one. If you are a Family Guy fan who has been waiting for someone to take this show seriously enough to actually dig into what makes it work, I hope this delivered for you. Drop in the comments what your favorite Season 5 episode is, because I want to know. And I have very strong opinions about this that I will absolutely argue with you about. Make sure you subscribe, because we do this kind of thing regularly, and there is a lot more to come. What if I told you that one of the most beloved animated seasons in television history almost never existed at all? We are talking about Family Guy Season 3, a collection of episodes that helped define adult animation forever. And today, we are diving into the wildest, most surprising, and genuinely fascinating facts about that iconic run that most fans have absolutely no idea about. Stick around, because some of these are going to completely change the way you watch the show. I promise you that by the end of this video, your brain is going to be full of trivia that will make you the most dangerous person at any Family Guy fan gathering. Let us get into it. So before we even touch the first fact, let us set the scene. Season 3 of Family Guy aired back in 2001, and it came at a time when the show was fighting for its life. The ratings were inconsistent, the network had complicated feelings about the content, and nobody really knew if Family Guy was going to stick around long enough to matter. And yet, Season 3 ended up being this incredible creative explosion, where the writers were clearly pushing every single boundary they could find. The results were some of the most memorable moments in cartoon history. But here is what makes Season 3 extra special. And this is something most people gloss over. This was the last season before Fox canceled the show the first time. So, every episode in Season 3 carries this almost unintentional weight of finality, even though the creators had no idea at the time that the curtain was about to fall. That context changes everything when you go back and rewatch those episodes. Now let us talk about the episode that opened Season 3 and the chaos surrounding it. The season kicked off, and immediately the show was doing things that other animated programs simply were not doing. The writing staff during this period included some incredibly talented people who were willing to take massive creative swings. And Season 3 is where you can really feel that fearlessness radiating from the screen. The cutaway gags were getting sharper, the character dynamics were getting more defined, and Peter Griffin was evolving from a somewhat generic bumbling dad into this specific, bizarre, deeply funny character that audiences were falling in love with. That transformation happened largely in Season 3, and it is worth appreciating just how deliberate that was. Here is a fact that blows people's minds when they first hear it. The Quagmire character, who we all know and either love or have complicated feelings about, underwent significant development during Season 3. The writers were actively figuring out exactly what made Quagmire funny versus what made him just uncomfortable. And that calibration process produced some of the funniest Quagmire moments in the entire run of the series. What is fascinating is that the voice performance by Mike Henry, combined with the writing choices, created this almost cartoon physics version of a problematic character that audiences somehow found hilarious rather than off-putting. The Season 3 writing staff deserves enormous credit for threading that needle, and it was far from accidental. Let us talk about Stewie Griffin for a moment, because Season 3 is absolutely crucial to understanding how this character became the fan favorite that he is today. In the earlier seasons, Stewie was primarily coded as this theatrical villain baby with world domination plans, and a strange obsession with eliminating his mother. That core was always there. But Season 3 started introducing these little moments of vulnerability and absurdity that made Stewie feel more like a complete character rather than just a one-note gag. The writers began experimenting with what happened when you put Stewie in scenarios that had nothing to do with his evil plans, and the results were some of the most quoted lines and moments the show has ever produced. The evolution of Stewie Griffin as a comedic character is one of the great stories of Season 3. And most fans do not fully appreciate how much of that transformation happened during this specific run of episodes. Now here is something genuinely interesting from a production standpoint. The animation during Season 3 had some notable quirks and inconsistencies. And this was not laziness or carelessness. The production pipeline for animated television in the early 2000s was genuinely complicated, and Family Guy was working with international animation studios to bring the episodes to life. This meant that the creative vision articulated in the storyboards and scripts sometimes came back looking slightly different than intended. What is remarkable is that some of those happy accidents actually became beloved character animation moments. There are specific scenes in Season 3 where the animation does something unexpected, and it actually makes the joke funnier rather than undermining it. That kind of serendipity is part of what gives animated shows from this era their particular charm. Let us jump to one of the most famous episodes from Season 3, which is the Road to Rhode Island episode, and I want to share some context that most casual fans have never heard. This episode was groundbreaking in ways that the fan community sometimes underestimates. It established the road to format that would become one of Family Guy's most beloved recurring structures throughout the entire series. The decision to send Stewie and Brian on an adventure together was not obviously correct at the time. These were two characters who existed in very different comedic registers, one being a sophisticated intellectual dog, and the other being a murderous infant genius. And combining them required real creative confidence. The chemistry that emerged from that pairing became one of the most valuable creative assets the show has ever had. The music in Road to Rhode Island deserves its own discussion because this is where Family Guy really committed to the idea that it could be a genuine musical comedy. Seth MacFarlane's vocal abilities were deployed in a way that demonstrated this was not just a novelty. It was a legitimate artistic strength. The songs in that episode hold up in a way that most television songs from 2001 simply do not. There is a craftsmanship to those musical moments that reflects the genuine passion the creative team had for classic Hollywood musical traditions. MacFarlane grew up loving that era of entertainment, and Season 3 is where that love started flowing most freely into the actual content of the show. Okay, here is a fact that is going to make you look at the show differently. The writing room for Season 3 was producing scripts at an absolutely brutal pace, and the pressure on the writers was immense. Television animation has notoriously punishing schedules because you have to write the scripts far enough in advance to allow for the entire production pipeline to function, which means writers are sometimes working a year or more ahead of when an episode will actually air. This creates an interesting creative pressure cooker situation where the writers are making jokes and cultural references without always knowing exactly when or whether those references will land with audiences. Some of the most confident comedic swings in Season 3 were written by people who had no guarantee the show would even still be on the air when those episodes finally broadcast. Brian Griffin is another character whose Season 3 development deserves serious attention. The show was really starting to lean into the tension between Brian's self-image as a sophisticated intellectual and the reality of his often embarrassing and ordinary dog behaviors and desires. That gap between aspiration and reality is genuinely one of the richest comedic veins in the entire series, and Season 3 is where the writers started mining it most deliberately. The jokes about Brian's novel, his drinking, his failed romantic relationships, these all started crystallizing in Season 3 into the fully formed comedic portrait that audiences would spend the next 2 decades loving and laughing at. Here is something that speaks to the cultural impact of Season 3 specifically. Many of the episodes from this season ended up being the ones that lived on in pop culture memory long after the show itself was temporarily canceled. When Family Guy came back from the dead in 2005 thanks to DVD sales and Adult Swim reruns, a lot of the content that had converted casual viewers into passionate fans was from Season 3. People would buy the DVD sets and discover episodes they had never seen, and the Season 3 episodes were disproportionately represented among the ones that made people fall in love with the show all over again. That resurrection story is one of the most remarkable in television history, and Season 3 is a central chapter of it. Now, let us talk about Meg Griffin because this is actually a complicated and interesting story. Season 3 began more firmly establishing Meg as the family punching bag, and while that is not a particularly flattering role, the way the writers handled it during this season was actually more nuanced than it gets credit for. Meg had genuine comedic moments in Season 3 that went beyond just being the butt of jokes. And there were episodes where her perspective was treated with something approaching empathy. The full descent of Meg into pure punching bag territory happened later in the series. In Season 3, there was still some genuine attempt to give her a character beyond that function, and watching those episodes now you can see the writers wrestling with what they wanted to do with this character. Let us talk about the Cleveland character for a moment because Season 3 contains some excellent Cleveland moments that rarely get discussed. Cleveland Brown as a character was always operating as this calm, measured counterpoint to Peter's chaos, and the comedy of that contrast was working really well during Season 3. The specific dynamic between Cleveland and Peter during this period of the show has a warmth to it that later seasons sometimes lost. And if you go back and watch the Season 3 episodes specifically looking at how Cleveland and Peter interact, you notice these small character moments that are genuinely lovely in addition to being funny. Here is a production fact that most fans would find genuinely surprising. The voice recording sessions for Family Guy happen before the animation is produced, which means the animators are working from the actors' vocal performances to create the visuals rather than the other way around. This process means that the comedic timing you hear in the finished episodes is entirely dependent on the actors nailing their deliveries in the recording booth without the context of seeing the finished animation. For Season 3, which contains some extremely precise comedic timing in its cutaway gags and dialogue exchanges, this means the cast was essentially performing these jokes somewhat blind and trusting that the finished product would land correctly. The fact that so many of those moments work perfectly is a testament to the skill of that voice cast. Let us get into something that Season 3 does that I think is genuinely underappreciated in discussions about the show's creative legacy. Season 3 represents maybe the purest version of what Family Guy was actually trying to be before network pressure and demographic targeting started influencing the creative direction in more visible ways. There is an anarchic quality to some of the Season 3 storytelling that feels almost experimental by the standards of primetime animation at the time. Episodes would take structural detours that had no narrative justification beyond the fact that they were funny, and the confidence required to do that on a major network primetime show in 2001 was actually quite remarkable. Now, something really fascinating about Season 3 from an animation history perspective. The cutaway gag format, which Family Guy essentially popularized and which has since been copied and adapted by countless other animated shows and even some live-action productions, was really hitting its creative peak during Season 3. The ratio of setup to payoff in those cutaways was dialed in to an almost scientific degree by this point in the show's run. Earlier seasons had cutaways that sometimes went on too long or did not quite justify the interruption to the main story. By season 3, the writers had figured out the exact length and style that made those interruptions feel like rewards rather than distractions. That formula is now so familiar it almost feels inevitable, but someone had to figure it out, and it happened largely in season 3. Here is something that connects season 3 to the broader culture of the early 2000s in interesting ways. The references and satirical targets in season 3 reflect a very specific moment in American pop culture and politics. And revisiting those episodes now gives them this unexpected quality as time capsules. You are watching jokes about things that were current events in 2001, filtered through the sensibility of writers who were themselves products of a particular generation and cultural background. Some of those references land differently today than they did at the time, and in some cases they have actually gained new meaning that the writers could not have anticipated. That time capsule quality is one of the unexpected pleasures of re-watching season 3 with fresh eyes. Let us talk about one of the more technically impressive things season 3 accomplished, which is the escalation of the show's musical ambition. Beyond Road to Rhode Island, season 3 had multiple episodes where original songs played significant roles, and the level of craft in those compositions was higher than most people realize. Writing a song that works as a joke is genuinely difficult because the music has to function well enough that it does not distract from the comedic content. But the comedic content has to be strong enough that it does not need the music as a crutch. The season 3 team was threading that needle with impressive consistency, and it laid the groundwork for the increasingly ambitious musical moments that Family Guy would deliver in later seasons. Okay, here is a fact about season 3 that touches on something almost philosophical about animated television. One of the persistent debates in the Family Guy fan community is about which era of the show represents its creative peak. A significant portion of serious fans will argue that season 3 is where the show was firing on all cylinders before it became too aware of its own reputation and started playing to the crowd in less interesting ways. There is a freshness to season 3, a sense that the creators were still surprising themselves with what the show could do, that makes it feel qualitatively different from even some excellent later seasons. Whether you agree with that assessment or not, the argument is worth taking seriously. Let us discuss the episode Death Lives, which is one of the more emotionally interesting pieces of content in season 3, and one that does not always get the recognition it deserves. This episode took the show in a more sentimental direction without completely abandoning its comedic identity, and that balance is actually quite hard to achieve. The Peter and Lois relationship is treated with genuine affection in this episode, and the show demonstrates that underneath all the chaos and absurdity, there was a real marriage at the center of the story with actual emotional stakes. That emotional foundation is part of what separated Family Guy from pure nihilistic animation. And season 3 episodes like this one are where that foundation was most clearly visible. Here is something about the cultural footprint of season 3 that speaks to how influential this period of the show was. If you look at the development of adult animation throughout the 2000s and 2010s, shows that came later were clearly processing what Family Guy season 3 had done. The combination of pop culture satire, cutaway humor, musical comedy, and character-based emotional storytelling that season 3 exemplified became almost a template that other shows were either following or explicitly reacting against. The influence is not always acknowledged, but it is absolutely present, and season 3 is the purest expression of that template. Now let us get into something that fans of the show who pay close attention to continuity always find interesting about season 3. This season has some notable continuity quirks that are partly a product of the era in which it was made. Animated shows in the early 2000s were not the serialized continuity-conscious productions that many of them are today. Each episode was largely designed to stand alone, which meant that character details and even some plot elements could shift between episodes without any official acknowledgement. Season 3 has some of these moments, and rather than being flaws, They are actually interesting artifacts of a storytelling philosophy that prioritized each individual episode being as funny as possible over maintaining a rigid internal canon. Let us talk about the role of Peter Griffin's job at the brewery during Season 3 because this is one of those elements that grounded the show in a specific social and economic reality that gave the humor weight. The Pawtucket Brewery setting allowed the writers to do class and workplace comedy alongside the domestic and pop culture material, and Season 3 made good use of that setting. The relationship between Peter and his boss, Mr. Pewterschmidt's world, versus the working-class Quahog neighborhood where the Griffins lived, was a genuine thematic underpinning of the show during this era, even if that thematic richness was never something the show advertised or made explicit. Here is something about the Season 3 premiere that most fans have never specifically thought about. The way a season premiere functions for an animated show is somewhat different from how it works for a live-action show, because animated shows do not have the visual shock of a cast returning after a hiatus or the dramatic revelation of new settings and costumes. An animated show has to establish that a new season is beginning entirely through the quality and tone of its storytelling. Season 3 did this effectively, and there is a confidence in the early episodes of the season that signals the creative team felt they had figured something important out about how the show worked. Let us get into the villain energy of Season 3 for a moment because this is genuinely fun to think about. The show during this period had a real appetite for creating characters who operated as antagonists within individual episodes. And the variety and creativity of those antagonistic figures was genuinely impressive. From petty social rivalries to larger absurdist conflicts, Season 3 gave us a gallery of minor antagonists that served as perfect foils for the Griffin family's particular brand of chaos. That villain variety kept episodes feeling fresh, even when the show was working within its established comedic formulas. Now, here is a fact that really puts Season 3 in interesting historical context. When these episodes were originally airing, the DVR did not yet exist as a widespread technology. Most viewers were watching Family Guy live, which means the audience experience was fundamentally different from how modern viewers discover and consume the show. There was no pausing, rewinding, or replaying that perfect joke delivery. Viewers had one shot to catch everything happening on screen, and the writers were essentially designing jokes for an audience that was going to experience each moment exactly once in real time. That design constraint produced a style of comedy that is actually quite sophisticated in how it layers visual and verbal gags, so that even if you miss one element, another is there to land. Let us talk about something that the animators working on Season 3 deserves recognition for, which is the visual character acting that made the humor land beyond just the writing and voice performances. There are moments throughout Season 3 where the character animation does something unexpected with an expression or a physical movement that elevates a joke from funny to hilarious. The timing of a held expression, the specific way a character's eyes move before a punchline lands. These are decisions made by animators that do not get enough credit in conversations about why Family Guy worked so well during this period. Season 3 is full of excellent character animation choices that reward close attention. Here is a fact about Seth MacFarlane's creative vision during Season 3 that provides useful context. MacFarlane was remarkably young when he was running this show, and the ambition and confidence reflected in Season 3 is all the more impressive when you consider that context. He was synthesizing influences from classic Hollywood, old-school television comedy, musical theater, and contemporary satire into something that felt genuinely original, and he was doing it at an age when most people are still figuring out their creative identities. Season 3 represents MacFarlane's creative voice in something close to its purest early form, and before the show became such a massive cultural institution that it inevitably started influencing itself. Let us address the Lois Griffin factor in Season 3 because this character is sometimes overlooked in discussions about what made this season great. Lois during Season 3 was depicted as genuinely capable and often the smartest person in any given situation, while also having her own blind spots and comedic vulnerabilities. That balance made her an effective comedic character in a way that she sometimes was not in later seasons when the show started using her more narrowly. Season 3. Lois had agency and dimension, and that enriched every episode she was central to, which was most of them. Now, something genuinely wild about how Season 3 ended up being received versus how it was received at the time. Contemporary reviews of Season 3 Family Guy were decidedly mixed. The critics at the time had not yet figured out how to evaluate what Family Guy was doing, partly because the show was operating at a frequency that was somewhat alien to the critical frameworks that existed for animated television. The standard was set largely by The Simpsons, which was a very different animal, and critics who applied Simpsons criteria to Family Guy often found it wanting in exactly the ways that its actual fans found it most thrilling. The rehabilitation of Season 3's critical reputation happened retroactively, as the show's cultural influence became undeniable. Here is something about the Season 3 guest voices that is worth knowing. Animated shows rely on their guest voice performances in interesting ways because, unlike live-action guest appearances, animated guests are present only through their voices. The guest voices in Season 3 were used with real creativity, and in several cases, the casting choices for guest roles demonstrated an awareness of comedy history and entertainment culture that added layers to the humor for viewers who got the references. Those choices reflected the genuine depth of entertainment knowledge in the Family Guy writing room during this period. Let us talk about the ending of Season 3 and what it meant in the context of the show's history. The season ended without any fanfare or acknowledgement that it might be the last batch of new Family Guy episodes for years. There was no dramatic finale, no attempt to wrap up story threads in a way that would provide closure if the show did not return. It just ended the way every other episode ended, with the Griffins in their house in Quahog, and then the show was gone. That quiet ending makes Season 3 feel even more interesting in retrospect, because there is something bittersweet about watching those final episodes of the original run, knowing what was coming. The show was about to disappear, and nobody involved knew that the story was going to eventually come back with one of the most remarkable second acts in television history. The legacy of Season 3 is genuinely hard to overstate. When Family Guy returned in 2005, and the creative team was returning to a set of characters and a comedic voice that had been defined and refined through 3 seasons, and Season 3 was the most fully realized expression of that original voice. The new episodes had to recapture what those original seasons had done while also moving forward, and understanding Season 3 is essential to understanding both how successful and how complicated that creative challenge was. Season 3 was the finishing point of the original Family Guy, and everything that came after existed in dialogue with what those episodes had established. Let us close with something that really captures why Season 3 matters beyond the facts and trivia we have covered. Family Guy at its best is a show that is simultaneously stupid and sophisticated, mean and warm, cynical and sentimental. Those contradictions are not accidental, and they are not awkward compromises. They are the whole point. And Season 3 is where all of those contradictions were most perfectly balanced. The show had figured out how to be all of those things at once, without any of them undermining the others. And it would be years before it consistently managed that balance again. That is what makes Season 3 special, not just as a television artifact, but as a creative achievement worth studying and appreciating. So there you have it. A whole collection of random but genuinely fascinating facts about Family Guy Season 3 that should give you a much richer appreciation for what that season was doing and why it still matters. Whether you are a longtime fan who grew up with these episodes or a newer viewer discovering the show's history, Season 3 rewards the kind of attention we have been giving it today. If you enjoyed this video and want more deep dives into the history and behind-the-scenes details of shows like Family Guy, make sure you are subscribed because we have a ton more content like this coming. Drop a comment below telling me which Season 3 episode is your personal favorite, and let me know if there are any specific Family Guy topics you want us to cover in future videos. See you in the next one. Alright, before we get into this, I need to ask you something. How well do you actually think you know Family Guy? Because most people who call themselves fans would probably score about a 6 out of 10 on what I'm about to share with you. Season 6 of Family Guy is one of those seasons that sits in this weird, fascinating place in the show's history. And there are details buried inside it that even the most dedicated fans have completely missed. We're talking behind-the-scenes chaos. Voice acting secrets, pop culture connections that will make you do a double take, and some genuinely bizarre creative decisions that somehow produced some of the most memorable television moments of the mid-2000s. So, stick around, because we're going to go through the whole thing, and I promise you're going to learn something that genuinely surprises you. Let's start at the very beginning of Season 6, because context matters here. Family Guy was already a resurrected show by this point. It had famously been canceled, brought back through DVD sales and Adult Swim reruns, and by the time Season 6 rolled around in 2007, the writers were working with a kind of creative freedom that most television shows never get. When you've already been canceled and brought back from the dead, what exactly do you have to lose? That mindset absolutely shows in the choices they made throughout this season, and it explains why some of the episodes feel almost recklessly experimental compared to what other animated comedies were doing at the time. Season 6 premiered in the fall of 2007, and it opened with an episode called Blue Harvest. Now here's where things get genuinely interesting. Blue Harvest was the show's retelling of Star Wars, specifically the original 1977 film, and the entire episode was framed as Peter telling the story to his family during a power outage. The episode clocked in at around 45 minutes, which made it essentially a television movie. But the detail that most people don't know is that Blue Harvest was actually the real working title that George Lucas used when he was filming Return of the Jedi back in 1982. Lucas used that fake title to keep the production secret and prevent fans and media from knowing what they were actually filming. So when Seth MacFarlane and his team named the Family Guy Star Wars special after that obscure piece of film history trivia, they were paying a genuinely clever tribute to the franchise they were parodying. That's the kind of layered reference that you'd only catch if you were already deep into Star Wars lore. And speaking of Blue Harvest, let's talk about the cast. The episode featured the regular Family Guy cast essentially playing versions of the Star Wars characters, with Peter as Han Solo, Lois as Princess Leia, Chris as Luke Skywalker, Stewie as Darth Vader, Quagmire as C-3PO, Cleveland as R2-D2, and Brian as Chewbacca. Now what's remarkable here is the actual voice work involved. Seth MacFarlane was voicing 4 of those characters simultaneously in various scenes: Peter, Stewie, Quagmire, and Brian, and having to maintain distinct character voices while also riffing on these iconic Star Wars archetypes was a genuinely demanding performance challenge. The episode received such a strong reception that it actually spawned 2 more Star Wars specials in later seasons, which is something the writers hadn't necessarily planned when they were putting Blue Harvest together. The success caught even them a little off guard. Now let me hit you with something you almost certainly didn't know about this season. The episode Movin' Out Brian's song from Season 6 involves Brian moving in with Jillian, his girlfriend at the time. And this episode contains one of the most carefully constructed running jokes in the show's history up to that point. The entire episode plays with the tension between Brian's intellectual self-image and the reality of his actual behavior, and the writers used Stewie's commentary as a kind of Greek chorus throughout. What's interesting from a production standpoint is that the writers' room spent a disproportionate amount of time on Stewie's reaction beats in this episode specifically because they knew that Brian and Stewie's dynamic was becoming the emotional core of the show. The audience's attachment to those 2 characters was measurably stronger by Season 6 than it had been in earlier seasons, and the writers were consciously leaning into that. Here's another layer to this. Family Guy's writing staff underwent some notable shifts heading into and during Season 6. The show had a reputation in Hollywood for being a difficult but creatively energizing place to work, and the combination of returning veterans and fresh writing talent created a slightly different comedic voice in Season 6 compared to Season 5. You can actually hear this if you go back and listen carefully. The cutaway gags feel a touch more elaborate in Season 6. Like the writers were more willing to build out a full comedic scenario rather than just dropping in a quick reference. The jokes have a bit more architecture to them, and that's not an accident. That reflects a writer's room that was feeling confident and willing to take swings. Let's talk about Stewie Griffin for a moment, because there's a fascinating evolution happening with this character specifically in Season 6. When Family Guy first launched, Stewie was conceived as a genuinely sinister baby with a legitimate plan for world domination. The humor came from the contrast between his evil ambitions and his literal status as an infant. But by Season 6, Stewie had transformed into something much more complex and, frankly, much funnier. His relationship with Brian had become the show's most sophisticated comedic pairing. His sexuality was being hinted at with increasing frequency and creativity, and his emotional life had become genuinely rich and textured. The world domination stuff was still there, but it was more of a background character trait rather than the engine driving his stories. This shift in Stewie's character is actually something Seth MacFarlane has discussed in various interviews over the years. He's acknowledged that the original Stewie concept was somewhat limiting because you could only do so much with a baby who purely wants to take over the world. The version of Stewie that emerged through Season 6 and beyond was a character who could carry a broader range of stories, from absurdist comedy to genuine emotional beats. And Season 6 is really where you can see that transformation solidified. It's a pivotal season for Stewie, even if fans don't always recognize it as such. Now here's a fact that I find genuinely surprising. Season 6 of Family Guy aired during one of the most competitive periods in animated television history. This was 2007 and 2008, right in the middle of a golden age for adult animation. The Simpsons was still running, South Park was hitting some of its most critically acclaimed years, Futurama had already ended but was about to be revived, and American Dad, which shares production resources and creative DNA with Family Guy, was finding its footing. In that landscape, Season 6 had to work hard to maintain Family Guy's identity and audience. And the fact that it succeeded speaks to how well the team understood what made their show distinct. The thing that made Family Guy distinct, and Season 6 exemplifies this beautifully, was a willingness to completely abandon narrative logic in service of a joke. Other animated shows, even transgressive ones, tended to follow some kind of internal story logic. Family Guy would cheerfully blow that up if it meant landing a better punchline. The show weaponized non sequitur in a way that was genuinely new, and Season 6 refined that weapon to a sharp edge. Let me give you a specific example from the season. There's a moment in the episode Peter's Daughter where the show commits to an extended physical comedy bit involving Peter in a way that goes on significantly longer than you expect. Past the point of comfort, past the point where you think the joke is finished, and then keeps going until it wraps back around to being funny again through sheer persistence. This technique, holding a joke beyond its natural endpoint until it becomes funny in a completely different way, is something the Family Guy writers developed into almost a signature move. And Season 6 has some of the best examples of this technique in the show's entire run. Peter's Daughter is also notable for featuring a storyline where Peter becomes intensely overprotective of Meg after she ends up in a coma. Now the Meg storyline is interesting because throughout the series, Meg is treated as the family punching bag, the character whose suffering is played for laughs. But occasionally, the show would do something genuinely interesting with her character. And Peter's Daughter is one of those moments. The protectiveness Peter shows, even though it comes from a selfish and controlling place rather than genuine parental love, still represented a slightly different dynamic between Peter and Meg than the show usually explored. It's not a redemption arc by any stretch, but it's a moment of complexity in what could have been a flat character. Okay, here's a fact that will genuinely shock some of you. The Season 6 episode titled I Dream of Jesus is the episode where the Surfin' Bird song by the Trashmen becomes a recurring element, with Peter becoming obsessively enthusiastic about the song to a deranged degree. What many people don't realize is that this episode essentially launched a second life for that song. The Trashmen had a novelty hit with Surfin' Bird back in 1963, and while the song had experienced various moments of cultural relevance over the decades, The Family Guy episode genuinely introduced it to a massive new generation of viewers. After I Dream of Jesus aired, there was a measurable spike in downloads and searches for the song. The show didn't just reference pop culture in this case. It actively changed the cultural trajectory of a 40-plus-year-old song. And the choice to use that song specifically is interesting when you think about it. Surfin' Bird is exactly the kind of chaotic, repetitive, nonsensical piece of music that perfectly fits Family Guy's comedic sensibility. The joke works on multiple levels. There's the surface-level absurdity of Peter's obsession. There's the meta-commentary on how certain pieces of media get lodged in your brain against your will. And there's the deeper layer of the show essentially asking the audience to experience exactly what Stewie and Brian are experiencing: annoyance, helplessness, and eventually a kind of reluctant amusement. It's genuinely clever construction wrapped in an extremely silly package. Let me shift gears and talk about the voice cast for a minute, because there are some fascinating details here that most fans don't know. Mila Kunis, who voices Meg Griffin, was already a significant television star by season 6 due to her work on that 70s show. But despite her rising profile in the entertainment industry, she maintained a relatively low public profile as a voice actress specifically. One of the interesting aspects of voice acting work is that it allows performers to do things with a character that their public image might make difficult in live action. And Meg's position as the show's punching bag created a genuinely unique professional situation for Kunis. She's spoken in interviews about how she approached finding the specific vocal quality that makes Meg sound appropriately pathetic and earnest without tipping over into caricature. And season 6 is a good place to hear that balance being maintained really effectively. Seth Green, who voices Chris Griffin, has a particularly interesting relationship with season 6. By this point, Green was also running Robot Chicken on Adult Swim, which meant he was simultaneously functioning as both a performer in someone else's creative vision and as a showrunner in his own right. The cross-pollination of ideas between those two creative environments is something fans of both shows occasionally spotted, though the approaches to parody and pop culture commentary are quite different between Family Guy and Robot Chicken. Now let's talk about something that gets overlooked when people discuss season 6, and that's the music. Family Guy has always had an unusually sophisticated relationship with music for an animated comedy. And season 6 features some of the show's most ambitious musical moments. The show employs a full team of composers and music coordinators, and the work they do in season 6 to support the Star Wars special alone is remarkable. Blue Harvest essentially required them to create a version of John Williams' iconic score that was simultaneously recognizable enough to trigger the audience's nostalgia and altered enough to function as parody. Getting that balance right required genuine musical craft. And if you go back and watch Blue Harvest with headphones paying close attention to the score, you'll hear how much work went into it. The show's regular composer, Walter Murphy, who has worked with Family Guy since its early seasons, has a background that includes working with John Williams himself, which makes the Blue Harvest scoring assignment a kind of full-circle moment that most fans have never thought about. Murphy's jazz and orchestral background gives Family Guy's musical palette a range and sophistication that contributes enormously to how the show lands its jokes. And season 6 showcases that musical intelligence at a high level. Here is something interesting about the production timeline for season 6. Family Guy operates on an unusually long production pipeline for animation. By the time an episode airs, the writers, animators, voice actors, and post-production teams have all been working on it for well over a year. This means that when season 6 was airing in 2007 and 2008, the writers' room had already moved on to planning season 7 in significant ways. The long lead time creates an interesting creative challenge because you're essentially writing jokes about a cultural moment that may or may not still be relevant by the time your episode actually reaches an audience. The writers in season 6 were specifically making choices to include more timeless comedic premises alongside their topical references, and that balance is part of why season 6 holds up as well as it does when you rewatch it today. Let's talk about the Cleveland show connection for a minute, because it's relevant to season 6 in ways you might not have considered. Cleveland Brown, the soft-spoken neighbor and friend of Peter Griffin, was a regular presence throughout Season 6. And this was actually one of his final seasons as a supporting character on Family Guy before he was spun off into his own series. The Cleveland show premiered in 2009, which means that during the production of Season 6, the conversations about giving Cleveland his own show were likely already in early development stages. Knowing this adds an interesting layer to Cleveland's appearances in Season 6. The writers may have been consciously giving him material that showcased his comedic range, laying the groundwork for audiences to buy him as a lead character rather than a supporting one. And while we're on the subject of character development, let me talk about Quagmire in Season 6. Glenn Quagmire is one of the most interesting characters in the Family Guy universe because he functions simultaneously as a comedic vehicle for some of the show's most transgressive humor and as an occasional voice of actual moral clarity. In Season 6, there are moments where Quagmire essentially serves as the audience's surrogate, reacting to situations with the kind of grounded human response that the Griffin family members are too absurd to provide. It's a useful structural function, and the writers in Season 6 were particularly good at deploying Quagmire in this way without softening the character's essential outrageousness. Here's a production fact that I find fascinating. The Family Guy is recorded with the voice cast doing individual sessions rather than together as a group. This is standard practice for animated television, but it creates an interesting creative constraint, which is that the chemistry between characters on screen is being synthesized in post-production rather than captured live. The way Brian and Stewie's scenes feel so naturalistic and connected is a result of Seth MacFarlane essentially performing both sides of a conversation with himself at different times, and then editors and directors working to create the illusion of genuine, spontaneous interaction. The fact that this chemistry feels so real is a genuine tribute to both MacFarlane's voice work and the production team's skill. Season 6 also marks an interesting moment in the show's relationship with Fox as a network. Family Guy had a complicated history with Fox, having been canceled by them and then brought back. By Season 6, that tension had largely been absorbed into a functional working relationship, but the show still maintained a habit of biting the hand that fed it with jokes about Fox's programming and business decisions. This self-referential willingness to mock its own network home is part of what gave Family Guy its edge. And Season 6 contains several pointed jabs at Fox that the network apparently allowed through without significant interference. The relationship had evolved from adversarial to something more like a mutually beneficial creative tension. Now I want to bring up something about Season 6 that relates to how the show handles controversy, because this is a genuinely interesting aspect of the show's DNA. Family Guy has always courted controversy, and Season 6 was no exception. Some episodes pushed into territory that generated significant audience and critical pushback. What's interesting is how the show's writers processed that criticism. They were not particularly interested in backing down from transgressive material, but they were also not simply being provocative for its own sake. The best moments of Season 6 that court controversy do so because the transgression is in service of an actual point or an actual comedic observation. The worst moments, which exist in every season, are pure provocation without the comedic architecture to support them. The show's willingness to engage with disability, race, gender, and sexuality in Season 6 reflects the broader cultural conversation happening in comedy during that period, when the boundaries of acceptable satirical content were being actively negotiated in real time. Looking back from 2026, some of Season 6 ages better than other parts, and that's an honest assessment that most fans can make if they're watching with open eyes. Let me tell you about the episode McStroke, which is one of the more memorable episodes from Season 6. This episode involves Peter becoming addicted to fast food burgers and suffering a stroke as a result. What's interesting about McStroke from a craft perspective is how it balances absurdist comedy with what is actually a somewhat pointed critique of fast food culture and corporate responsibility. The episode aired during a period when public conversations about nutrition, fast food marketing, and health outcomes were quite prominent in American media, and the writers were clearly aware of that context. But rather than making a straightforward social commentary episode, they wrapped the critique inside classic Family Guy absurdism. which is exactly how the show does its best work on topics with real-world stakes. Here's a fact that connects Season 6 to the broader history of animation. Family Guy's animation style has always been deliberately simple compared to what was technically possible at the time of production. The show uses a limited animation approach that prioritizes comedic timing and voice performance over visual complexity. This is actually a very conscious artistic choice, one that connects Family Guy to the tradition of classic theatrical cartoons, where the humor came from performance and timing rather than visual spectacle. Season 6 maintains this approach, and you can see it most clearly in the human characters, whose designs are intentionally flat and slightly awkward in a way that enhances rather than undermines the comedy. The animation team did push their limits somewhat in Blue Harvest, where they were creating environments and action sequences inspired by Star Wars that required more visual ambition than a typical Family Guy episode. The space battle sequences in Blue Harvest represent some of the most technically demanding animation the show had produced up to that point, and the team pulled it off while maintaining the show's essential visual identity. It's a harder balance to strike than it looks. Let me give you another surprising fact. The Season 6 episode titled Long John Peter features Peter becoming friends with a pirate, and this episode is notable for a subplot involving Chris and a veterinarian that contains some of the most quotable dialogue from this particular season. What's interesting about Long John Peter from a writing perspective is how it structures two completely unrelated storylines in a way that creates a unified emotional tone. The A story and B story don't connect thematically in any obvious way, but they share a kind of freewheeling energy that makes the episode feel coherent despite its structural looseness. That's actually a sophisticated piece of writing craft, disguised as total chaos. Family Guy's storytelling structure in Season 6 often works this way. The show figured out early that audiences would follow almost any narrative thread as long as the comedy was working, and Season 6 represents the writers being fully confident in that knowledge. They were willing to take stories in directions that had no logical justification because they trusted their comedic instincts. And in Season 6 specifically, those instincts were firing at a very high level. Now let's talk numbers for a moment, because Season 6's ratings tell an interesting story. The season consistently drew audiences in the 8 to 10 million viewer range, which by the standards of 2007 and 2008 broadcast television was strong but not dominant. What's more significant than the raw numbers is the demographic breakdown. Family Guy in Season 6 was performing exceptionally well with the 18 to 34 male demographic that Fox prized most highly, and it was doing this while maintaining a core audience that skewed somewhat younger than typical primetime animation viewers. This demographic performance is what gave the show its commercial durability, and what allowed it to continue taking creative risks without the network applying significant pressure to soften its content. The DVD sales for Season 6 were also notable, continuing the pattern that had originally helped bring the show back from cancellation. People were buying the season set specifically because the commentary tracks, deleted scenes, and behind the scenes, material represented genuine additional value. The writers and cast were known for doing entertaining commentary that functioned almost as supplementary comedy in its own right. And Seth MacFarlane's commentary tracks in particular developed their own kind of fan following. Here's something about Season 6 that connects to what the show would become in later years. By Season 6, Family Guy had established a format that would essentially remain stable for the next decade and a half. The formula was set. The characters' personalities were fixed in recognizable grooves. The types of stories the show would and wouldn't tell were established. What Season 6 represents is the last moment where that formula felt genuinely fresh and elastic, rather than settled and predictable. Not fans who point to Seasons 4 through 6 as the golden age of Family Guy are often identifying this quality intuitively. The show is still surprising them on a regular basis. There's also something worth noting about Season 6 in the context of Seth MacFarlane's career trajectory. By 2007, MacFarlane was one of the most powerful figures in American animated television, with Family Guy and American Dad both on the air and a production company that was developing additional projects. Season 6 of Family Guy aired during a period when MacFarlane was also beginning to develop his public persona as a performer and public figure beyond voice acting and writing. His appearances at awards shows, his musical performances, and his increasing willingness to speak publicly on political and cultural topics were all building during this period. You can actually see this reflected in Family Guy Season 6, which has a slightly sharper political edge than some earlier seasons and a somewhat more developed sense of its own place in the cultural conversation. The episode It Takes a Village Idiot and I Married One is a particularly clear example of this. The episode features Lois running for mayor of Quahog on a platform of deliberately simplified, pandering political messaging, and it functions as a fairly pointed satire of American political culture and the way campaigns are conducted. This kind of political engagement was becoming more central to the show's identity by Season 6, and it reflects MacFarlane and his writers paying close attention to the world around them and finding comedy in its contradictions. Let me also mention something about the guest voices in Season 6, because animated shows often use celebrity appearances in interesting ways, and Family Guy is no exception. Season 6 features a roster of guest performers ranging from genuinely unexpected choices to more obvious celebrity fits. The casting team had developed a knack for finding performers who could subvert their own public images in the context of the show, playing against type in ways that generated comedy from the gap between expectation and reality. Some of the most effective guest appearances in Season 6 are from people you might not have expected to be funny in this context. And the element of surprise is doing significant comedic work in those moments. One more thing I want to highlight about Season 6 before we wrap up is its place in the larger animated comedy ecosystem. I mentioned earlier that this was a competitive period for adult animation, and I want to return to that point because it's really important for understanding why Season 6 looks the way it does. Family Guy in Season 6 was consciously differentiating itself from its competitors. It wasn't trying to be South Park, it wasn't trying to be The Simpsons, it wasn't even trying to be American Dad, its own sibling show. It was trying to be the most fully realized version of its own distinct thing, and Season 6 is where that distinctiveness feels most fully achieved. The show's detractors have always focused on its randomness, its lack of narrative cohesion, and what they see as its willingness to trade cheap shock value for genuine wit. And those criticisms aren't entirely without foundation. But what Season 6 demonstrates is that randomness deployed with genuine craft and comedic intelligence is not the same as randomness as a substitute for craft. The best moments of Season 6 are random in a way that reveals something true and funny about how the world works, and that's a much harder thing to accomplish than it looks. So where does this leave us? Season 6 of Family Guy is a fascinating artifact of a specific moment in American comedy, a show at the peak of its confidence, working with full creative freedom, led by one of the most distinctive voices in animated television, and producing work that was simultaneously disposable and genuinely artful. The Star Wars special gave them a prestige showcase. The character work on Brian and Stewie deepened the show's emotional core. The satirical episodes demonstrated the writer's engagement with the real world. And the pure absurdist comedy episodes showed a team that had mastered its own form. If you haven't gone back and watched Season 6 recently, I genuinely recommend it. Watch it the way I've been describing it to you today, with attention to the craft underneath the chaos, the choices underneath the randomness, and the genuine intelligence underneath the transgression. You'll see a different show than the one you remember, or the one you might have dismissed. And if you're already a devoted fan who knows every episode by heart, I hope some of what I've shared today made you see a few of those familiar moments from a slightly different angle. Because that's what great television does, right? It rewards you for coming back to it. It shows you something new even when you think you've seen everything. Season 6 of Family Guy, for all its randomness, for all its chaos, for all its determination to make you uncomfortable and then laugh anyway, absolutely qualifies as television worth coming back to. And that might be the most surprising fact of all. If you enjoyed this deep dive, hit that like button and subscribe, because we've got more of these coming on other seasons and other shows you grew up with. Drop in the comments which Family Guy season you think deserves this kind of deep dive treatment next, because I'm genuinely curious where your heads are at. I'll see you in the next one. Hey, what is up everyone? Welcome back to the channel. Before we get into today's video, I need you to do me a favor and just think about the last time you watched Family Guy Season 8. Because whether you remember it clearly or you are drawing a complete blank right now, I promise you there are things about that season that you absolutely never knew. And some of them are genuinely going to mess with how you see those episodes forever. We are talking behind-the-scenes chaos, wild production decisions, bizarre casting moments, and facts about individual episodes that the writers probably hoped nobody would ever piece together. So buckle up, because this is going to be one of those videos where you finish it and immediately want to rewatch the whole season with completely different eyes. Alright, let us just jump straight into it. Season 8 of Family Guy is one of those seasons that most fans have a complicated relationship with. It aired during the 2009 to 2010 television cycle, and it came during a period when the show was still riding the enormous wave of energy that came from its revival. For those who might not know the full story, Family Guy was actually canceled by Fox back in 2002 and then brought back in 2005 largely because of insane DVD sales and strong ratings on Adult Swim. By the time Season 8 rolled around, the show had been back for several years and the writers were in this interesting creative space where they were both incredibly confident and also somewhat experimental. That tension between confidence and experimentation is actually visible throughout Season 8 if you know what to look for, and that is a big part of what makes this season so fascinating to dig into. Let us start with something that a lot of casual fans overlook. Season 8 opens with an episode called Road to the Multiverse. And this episode is genuinely considered by many animation critics and fans alike to be one of the greatest episodes in the entire run of the show. Not just Season 8, the entire series. The episode involves Brian and Stewie traveling through different parallel universes using a remote control device, and each universe is animated in a wildly different style. You get a Flintstone-style universe, a Disney-style universe, a hyper-realistic universe, and a universe where everything is drawn in a crude, almost childlike way that is clearly a reference to another animated show, and several others. What most people do not realize is the sheer amount of additional production resources that went into making this single episode happen. The animation team essentially had to develop completely separate visual languages for each universe that Brian and Stewie visited. These were not just quick style changes. They were full commitments to distinct artistic approaches that required additional animators, different techniques, and in some cases, entirely different software pipelines. The Disney sequence in particular became something of a talking point because the quality of the animation in that segment was genuinely impressive, combining traditional Disney-style character movement with musical numbers that felt authentic to the classic Disney era. The fact that this episode landed at the very beginning of the season was a bold, creative choice because it essentially said to the audience, "We are not playing it safe this year." Now here is something that connects to that episode in a way most people have never considered. The road to episodes in Family Guy have their own fascinating internal history. Brian and Stewie's travel adventures became one of the most beloved recurring formats in the show. And by Season 8, the writers were aware that these episodes carried a particular weight with the audience. There is a creative pressure that comes with that kind of beloved format, where you know that fans are going to hold each new installment up against the previous ones and measure them carefully. Road to the Multiverse essentially responded to that pressure by going completely maximalist, throwing every possible creative resource at the episode to make it the biggest and most ambitious road to installment yet. And the gamble paid off enormously in terms of critical reception. Okay, let us talk about something a little more behind the scenes now, because this is where things start getting really interesting. Seth MacFarlane, who created the show and voices Peter, Stewie, Quagmire, and Brian, among others, has spoken in various interviews over the years about the challenge of maintaining creative energy across a long-running animated series. By Season 8, the show was well past the 100-episode mark, and the writing staff was navigating the very real challenge of keeping stories fresh. One of the ways the writing team approached this in Season 8 was by leaning into longer, more sustained, comedic and emotional commitments within single episodes. Rather than just loading every episode with rapid-fire cutaway gags, which had become a kind of signature of the show, Several Season 8 episodes pushed toward more coherent storytelling structures where the jokes emerged from character situations rather than being dropped in from the outside. This was not a complete tonal shift. Family Guy was still very much Family Guy. But there is a noticeable difference in how some Season 8 episodes are constructed compared to earlier seasons. Here is a fact that genuinely surprises people when they first hear it. The episode Quagmire's Baby, which is Season 8 Episode 6, tackles something that you really would not expect Family Guy to handle with any kind of sincerity, which is Quagmire suddenly discovering he has a baby daughter and having to figure out what to do with that responsibility. What makes this episode interesting from a production standpoint is how the writers balanced Quagmire's established character, which is built almost entirely around his relentless and exaggerated pursuit of women, against a storyline that required him to show genuine emotional depth. The writing staff reportedly had significant internal discussions about how far to push Quagmire's emotional journey without undermining the comedic foundation of who the character is. The result is an episode that manages to land some genuine emotional beats, while also not pretending that Quagmire is going to fundamentally change as a person. It is a delicate balance, and the episode mostly pulls it off. Now I want to talk about something that connects to the larger cultural moment that Season 8 was airing in. This was 2009 and 2010, and the United States was still in the middle of a significant economic recession. Television in general was grappling with how to address the anxiety and frustration of that cultural moment, and different shows handled it in different ways. Family Guy, being a satirical animated comedy, was in an interesting position because the show had always dealt heavily in cultural commentary and social satire. Season 8 contains several moments that feel very much like responses to the specific cultural atmosphere of that period. Jokes about financial insecurity, corporate greed, and the general sense that institutions were not working the way people expected them to. These elements are woven into the fabric of various episodes in ways that feel organic rather than forced, which is actually harder to do than it sounds. When satire feels too topical, it dates badly. But when it captures something genuine about a cultural mood, it can actually make episodes feel more resonant when you watch them years later. Let us shift gears and talk about guest stars, because Season 8 has some genuinely wild casting moments. One of the most talked about is the appearance of James Woods reprising his role as a fictionalized version of himself. James Woods had appeared in the show before, and the recurring gag around his character had built up a mythology within the Family Guy universe. By Season 8, the show brought him back and escalated the absurdity of his storyline in ways that felt both earned and completely unexpected. The thing about James Woods as a guest on Family Guy is that his willingness to lean into the self-deprecating and often unflattering portrayal of himself gave the writers enormous latitude to push the joke further each time. Not every celebrity who appears on animated shows is willing to be that game. And when they are, it usually produces much better comedic results. There is also a fascinating fact about the voice recording process for animated shows that connects to how Season 8 was made. Unlike live-action television, animated shows record their voice performances before the animation is produced. This means that the voice actors are essentially working from scripts in a recording booth without any visual reference for what their performance will ultimately look like. And Seth MacFarlane and the other regular voice cast had been doing this long enough by Season 8 that they had developed an almost intuitive sense of timing and rhythm that allowed them to land jokes in the recording booth that would then be built around in animation. But for guest stars, particularly those who came from primarily live-action backgrounds, this process could be disorienting. The energy of performing in front of a microphone in a recording studio, without any scene partner, without any set, without any of the traditional theatrical cues that tell you where a moment is landing, requires a particular kind of adjustment. Season 8 guests who came in with that understanding generally gave stronger performances, and you can actually hear the difference if you pay close attention. All right, here is something genuinely obscure that I find fascinating. The episode Dog Gone, which deals with Brian accidentally killing a neighbor's dog while driving and then becoming fixated on the idea that nobody really cares about a dog's life the way they would care about a human life. is in many ways one of the more philosophically interesting episodes the show has ever done. The premise sounds like it could go in a very simple direction, but the episode actually ends up grappling with some real questions about empathy, moral consistency, and how we value different kinds of lives. Now, here is the thing about this episode that most people miss. It aired at a time when the writers were clearly interested in pushing Brian's character in more intellectually ambitious directions. Brian, who is an aspiring writer and the show's vehicle for a certain kind of liberal intellectual self-image, had been the subject of some fan debate about whether his pretensions were being played as something to laugh at or something to take seriously. Doggone is an episode that sort of threads that needle by giving Brian a genuinely interesting moral concern to wrestle with, while also not entirely letting him off the hook for how self-righteous he can be about it. Let us talk about the animation itself for a moment, because Season 8 represents a specific period in how the show was being made technically. By this point, the show had fully transitioned into high-definition production. And this transition affected not just the visual quality, but also certain aspects of how scenes were designed and how gags were staged. HD animation allows for much more detailed character expressions and background work. But it also means that anything sloppy or inconsistent is much more visible. The animation team working on Season 8 was operating at a higher level of technical precision than the show had required in its earlier seasons. And you can see this in how backgrounds became more elaborate and how character acting in key moments became more nuanced. This is one of those things that you often absorb as a viewer without consciously registering it. The show just somehow looks and feels slightly different, and a big part of that is the commitment to HD production quality. Now I want to get into something that connects to the creative DNA of the show in a really interesting way. Seth MacFarlane has always been open about his admiration for classic Hollywood entertainment, particularly old-school variety shows, musical comedy, and the kind of theatrical showmanship that was a big part of mid-20th century American entertainment. This influence runs through Family Guy in all kinds of ways. From the musical numbers that appear in almost every episode, to the comedic sensibility that values a certain kind of performative craft, alongside the more anarchic humor the show is known for. In Season 8, this musical sensibility shows up in several memorable moments. The Disney sequence in Road to the Multiverse is obviously the biggest example, but there are musical moments scattered throughout the season that reflect this same love of classic entertainment forms. What is interesting from a production standpoint is that these musical numbers require a completely different kind of creative work than the regular comedic writing. You need composers, lyricists, arrangement choices, and the voice cast needs to actually sing these songs, which adds another layer of performance demand to an already complex production. Here is a fact about Season 8 that tends to surprise people when they dig into the production timeline. Animated television has a notoriously long production pipeline, meaning that episodes are often being developed, written, and animated many months before they actually air. For a show like Family Guy, which relies heavily on cultural references and topical humor, this long pipeline creates an interesting challenge. Jokes that feel absolutely current when they are written in the writer's room might land slightly differently by the time they air months later. The writers had developed various strategies for managing this, including building in flexibility for topical material and focusing certain kinds of commentary on more enduring cultural patterns rather than specific news events. But there are moments in Season 8 where you can almost feel the writers calculating the shelf life of a particular reference, making a bet about what is still going to land when the episode finally airs. Let me tell you about something that most Family Guy fans have probably never thought about, which is the role of the table read in how Season 8 episodes were shaped. In television writing, a table read is a session where the cast reads through a completed script out loud together before production begins, and these sessions are often where scripts get significantly revised based on what works and what does not work when the words are actually spoken aloud. For Family Guy, no table reads take on a particular character because the regular cast includes Seth MacFarlane performing multiple distinct voices and characters, and hearing those voices interact in real time gives the writers immediate feedback about whether the rhythms and timing of a script are working. Several Season 8 episodes reportedly went through substantial revisions based on table read feedback, with jokes being reworked, scenes being reordered, and in some cases, entire plot lines being simplified or expanded based on what the table read revealed. This is an invisible part of the creative process that the audience never sees, but that has an enormous impact on the final product. All right, I want to spend some time on an episode that I think is genuinely underappreciated in terms of what it was trying to do. The episode Extra Large Medium, which is Season 8, Episode 12, involves Chris dating a girl with Down syndrome and includes some material that was considered controversial at the time of airing. There was a notable public controversy around this episode because a line of dialogue was interpreted by some people as a reference to the daughter of a prominent political figure, and this created a significant media moment around the episode. The interesting thing about how the Family Guy team handled this controversy is that it actually illustrates something important about how the show operates philosophically. The writers have always maintained that the show's satirical approach requires a certain willingness to go to uncomfortable places, and that pulling punches in order to avoid controversy would undermine the fundamental nature of what Family Guy is. Whether you agree with that philosophy or not, it is a consistent position that the show has held throughout its run, and Season 8 provides a particularly clear example of what the consequences of that position look like when they play out in the real world. Let us talk about something that connects to the business side of television because I think this context is often missing from discussions of creative decisions. By Season 8, Family Guy had become an enormously profitable property for Fox. The show generated revenue not just from advertising during broadcast, but from DVD sales, merchandise, syndication deals, and a whole ecosystem of ancillary business. This financial success gave the show a certain amount of creative latitude that not every television show gets to enjoy. When a show is a financial juggernaut for a network, the network is somewhat less likely to interfere with creative decisions because the risk calculation is different. The show's track record provides a kind of protective buffer around the creative team. This does not mean the writers had unlimited freedom, but it does mean that Season 8 was produced in an environment where the show had more leverage to take creative risks than a show in a more precarious financial position would have had. Now here is something genuinely cool that most people do not know about how the show handles its musical content. The music in Family Guy is composed by Ron Jones and Walter Murphy, among others, and the score for each episode is an original composition rather than a library of recycled cues. This is actually relatively unusual for animated television, where production costs often lead shows to rely on stock music or a small, rotating library of themes. The commitment to original scoring for each episode adds significantly to the production budget, but also contributes enormously to the show's distinctive feel. The way music is used in Family Guy, often swelling dramatically to underscore a joke, or cutting suddenly to create a comedic beat, or transitioning from a gag into a sincere, emotional moment, is a huge part of the show's identity. In Season 8, you can hear this musical intelligence working at a high level, particularly in episodes that shift between comedic and emotional registers, where the scoring has to do a lot of heavy lifting to manage those transitions. Here is a fact about Season 8 that connects to the show's relationship with its own continuity. Family Guy has always had an interesting and somewhat playful relationship with the idea of character continuity and narrative consistency. The show occasionally acknowledges that certain character traits or relationships have shifted over time, sometimes commenting on this directly through meta-jokes, and sometimes simply proceeding as though certain earlier moments did not happen. Season 8 contains several moments where the show's relationship with its own history becomes thematically relevant. Stewie's character arc over the preceding seasons had seen his originally sinister world domination-oriented character gradually soften into something more multi-dimensional. And Season 8 episodes like Stewie kills Lois and Lois kills Stewie are not in this season, but the evolution those episodes represented continues to shape how Stewie is written in Season 8. The writers were working with a character who had traveled a significant distance from his original conception, and Season 8 represents a particular moment in that evolution. All right, let us talk about the format of the show itself for a moment because Family Guy's structure is genuinely unusual in television history. The show uses cutaway gags as a core structural element, meaning that the narrative will frequently pause so that a character can say something like, "This is worse than the time I," and then cut to an apparently unrelated comedic scene. This format has been both celebrated as innovative and criticized as lazy, depending on who you ask. But what is interesting about Season 8 is how selectively the show deploys this structure. In episodes where the writers wanted to develop a more sustained narrative, cutaways are used more sparingly, almost as punctuation rather than as the primary comedic engine. In episodes that are more overtly comedic and less concerned with story, they appear more frequently. This modulation of the cutaway format is something you start to notice once you are watching for it. And it actually reveals a fair amount about how the writers thought about individual episodes and what they were trying to accomplish. I want to bring up something about the voice performance side of the show that I think is really underappreciated. Mila Kunis voices Meg Griffin, who is famously one of the most consistently mistreated characters in animated television. Meg is the butt of an enormous number of jokes throughout the series. And by Season 8, this had become a thoroughly established comedic convention. What is interesting about Mila Kunis's performance in this context is that she had to find ways to make Meg sympathetic and three-dimensional enough that the jokes about her have something real to bounce off of, without playing the character in a way that makes the constant mistreatment feel genuinely distressing. This is actually a delicate comedic challenge, and Kunis handles it with a kind of deadpan resigned quality that makes Meg one of the more interesting vocal performances in the show, even though she is not necessarily the most prominent character. Season 8 contains several Meg moments that illustrate this balance in interesting ways. Let me give you something really specific that you probably have never looked up. The episode Brian Griffin's House of Pain, which is Season 8, Episode 8, involves Brian getting a script optioned and then watching it get completely transformed from his original vision into something unrecognizable by the Hollywood development process. This episode is notable for how specifically it parodies the television and film development world, which suggests that the writers were drawing on genuine experiences and observations about how the entertainment industry actually works. When Seth MacFarlane and the writing team had been inside the Hollywood system long enough by this point that they had first-hand knowledge of exactly the kind of creative compromises and commercial pressures that the episode is satirizing. This gives the comedy a particular sharpness and specificity that parody tends to achieve when it comes from genuine experience, rather than second-hand observation. Okay, here is a slightly different kind of fact that I want to bring in because I think it enriches the picture of what Season 8 was. The show's writer's room during this period was a deliberately diverse group in terms of comedic sensibilities, backgrounds, and approaches. Seth MacFarlane has talked about how the Family Guy writer's room functioned as a kind of creative debate space where very different voices contributed to what the show became. This multiplicity of voices is part of why Family Guy can feel tonally varied in ways that some shows do not. You have material that is deeply absurdist sitting alongside material that is more grounded in character psychology, jokes that are purely shock-based sitting alongside jokes that require the audience to make intellectual connections. Season 8 reflects this tonal range perhaps more clearly than some other seasons because the individual episodes vary quite significantly in their approach and energy. Now let us talk about something that I think is fascinating from a pure storytelling craft perspective. Several Season 8 episodes deal with the theme of reputation versus reality, the gap between how characters are perceived and who they actually are. This shows up in the Quagmire Baby episode in terms of whether he is capable of genuine care. It shows up in Brian's House of Pain in terms of the gap between artistic intention and commercial product. It even shows up in various Peter episodes where his behavior is so disconnected from social norms that other characters are constantly having to reconcile who Peter is with what they expected him to be. Whether this is a deliberate thematic thread the writers were pursuing or simply a pattern that emerges from how the characters are constructed, it gives Season 8 a kind of coherence beneath its surface variety. Here is something about the production of animated comedies that relates directly to Season 8 and that most viewers have no reason to think about. The editing of an animated episode is fundamentally different from the editing of a live-action show because you are not working with footage that was captured on a set. Every scene, every cut, every transition is a deliberate construction that was planned and built from scratch. This means that the editors on Family Guy have an unusual degree of creative participation in the final shape of each episode. Timing decisions that in a live-action show might be settled in the editing room are in animation often built into the animation itself. But there is still significant editorial work that happens at the end of the pipeline where pacing, rhythm, and comedic timing can be adjusted. The editors working on Season 8 were part of a production team that had developed very specific instincts about where jokes needed to breathe and where the show needed to move quickly. And those instincts are part of what gives the season its particular rhythm. Let me take a moment to appreciate something about how Season 8 fits into the larger story of Family Guy as a cultural phenomenon. By this point in the show's history, Family Guy had become the kind of show that other shows made jokes about and referenced. It had achieved a level of cultural saturation where its characters, its jokes, and its comedic style had become part of the shared vocabulary of popular culture. This is a strange position for a show to be in because it means that the show is simultaneously creating culture and responding to how that culture has been absorbed and transformed by others. Season 8 is being made by a team that knows their work will be immediately subjected to enormous scrutiny and comparison, not just by casual viewers but by a genuinely passionate fan base that has very specific ideas about what the show is and what it should be. All right. Let me give you one more really interesting thing before we start wrapping this up. The episode Something 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 Dark Side, which is a Star Wars parody and the second installment of the show's Star Wars trilogy, aired in Season 8. This is another one of those landmark episodes that came to define the season in many people's memories, and for good reason. The production of this episode involved a level of cinematic ambition that is genuinely impressive for television animation. The team was essentially recreating entire sequences from The Empire Strikes Back, one of the most beloved films ever made, with the Family Guy characters substituted in. This required not just careful visual recreation, but a deep understanding of the original film's pacing, cinematography, and emotional logic, because the parody only works if you can feel the original underneath it. The writing needed to find the comedic pressure points where the insertion of Family Guy's characters and sensibility would create the maximum possible comic dissonance, and then trust that the audience's love of both the original film and these characters would make those moments land. The thing about both the Star Wars episodes and Road to the Multiverse is that they represent a particular philosophy of ambition that ran through Season 8 in a really defining way. These were episodes where the team essentially said, "We are going to attempt something genuinely difficult, something that requires more resources, more craft, and more creative courage than the average episode, and we are going to see if we can actually pull it off." The fact that both of these major episodes landed so well is part of why Season 8 has the reputation it does among fans who have followed the show closely. And that really is the thing about Season 8 that I want to leave you with. Nay, when you look at all of these facts together, what emerges is a picture of a show operating at a moment of real creative confidence and ambition. Not every episode in the season is a classic. That is true of every season of every long-running show. But the season as a whole represents a team that was genuinely pushing themselves, taking creative risks, developing their characters in meaningful ways, and investing seriously in the craft of making a show that was funny, and occasionally, something more than funny. The facts we have gone through today are not just trivia. They are windows into the decisions and processes and conversations that produced something a lot of people still watch and enjoy and argue about. That is what good television does. It gives you enough to keep coming back to it, enough layers that you can keep discovering new things even after you have seen it multiple times. So there you have it, a deep dive into some of the most fascinating and surprising facts about Family Guy Season 8. I hope this video gave you some new ways to think about a season you might have dismissed or taken for granted, or maybe gave you a reason to go back and watch it for the first time with all of this context in your head. If you enjoyed this video, do me a solid and hit that like button because it genuinely helps this channel reach more people who are into this kind of deep dive content. If you want to see more videos like this, whether it is more Family Guy breakdowns, animated show deep dives, or behind-the-scenes content about television production, make sure you are subscribed and hit that notification bell so you do not miss anything. Drop in the comments what your favorite Season 8 episode is. I would love to see what people say because I have a feeling Road to the Multiverse is going to absolutely dominate that conversation. But maybe you will surprise me. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.